After our own son shoved us toward the edge of a steep drop to claim our $4.8 million estate, I felt my husband's hand squeeze mine in the dirt. "Do not move." He breathed into my ear. "Let him bury himself." I am so glad you found my story. If you are listening to this, please like the video and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. I want to know how far my story of survival and justice has reached. I am Caroline, and I am 68 years old. My husband, Richard, is 70. Together, we spent 4 decades building a small chain of independent community pharmacies from absolute scratch. We started with one tiny corner store with a leaky roof and shelves we built ourselves. We worked 14-hour shifts, standing on our feet until our bones ached. I managed the front register, sorted the inventory, and balanced the books at the kitchen table every single night. Richard stood behind the pharmacy counter, dispensing medication and offering a kind word to every person in our community. We knew our customers by name. We delivered insulin to elderly folks in snowstorms because it was the right thing to do. We built our business on Christian values, hard work, and honest sweat. We poured every single ounce of our energy into securing a comfortable, privileged life for our only son, Julian. We wanted Julian to have everything we never had growing up. We paid for his private schooling and his college tuition in full. We bought him his first car brand new so he would never have to worry about breaking down on the side of the road. When he married his wife, Chloe, a polished young woman from a wealthy suburb, we paid for their extravagant country club wedding in cash. I always believed our family was a perfect, unbreakable unit. We went to church every Sunday. We hosted Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners at our large oak table. I thought Julian respected the sacrifices we made to give him his beautiful life. I thought he loved us, but money has a terrifying way of revealing a person's true soul. And the boy I raised, the boy I rocked to sleep and prayed over, was hiding a monster inside him. The nightmare did not begin at the edge of a cliff. It began on what should have been the happiest night of our lives, the night of our 45th wedding anniversary. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking. I made a beautiful pot roast, Julian's absolute favorite meal since he was a little boy. I set the dining room table with the good china and lit 2 white candles. Richard was wearing a nice suit, and I had put on a pearl necklace he gave me for our 20th anniversary. We were so excited to celebrate our life together with our son and daughter-in-law. When Julian and Chloe arrived, I immediately felt a coldness in the air. Julian did not bring flowers. He did not bring a card. Chloe walked into my home wearing a designer dress, her eyes scanning my living room with a look of barely concealed disgust. They sat down at the table, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Chloe barely touched her food, pushing the carrots around her plate with her fork while checking her phone constantly. Julian kept tapping his foot and glancing at his watch as if he had somewhere much more important to be. I tried to make conversation, asking Julian about his job as a financial consultant and asking Chloe about her recent trip to the city. They answered in short, clipped sentences. There was no warmth, there was no joy. Richard, always the peacemaker, tried to lighten the mood. He stood up from his chair, raising his crystal glass filled with sparkling cider. "I want to make a toast," Richard said, his voice full of emotion. "To my beautiful wife, Caroline, to 45 years of love, and to the wonderful family we have built." Before I could even raise my glass, Julian let out a loud, heavy sigh. He did not raise his glass. He did not smile. Instead, he reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the center of the dining room table. The heavy thud of the paper landing next to the candlelight made me jump. I looked at the envelope and then at my son, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "What is this, Julian?" I asked, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Are you giving us a vacation for our anniversary?" Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes were completely void of any affection. "Open it, Mom," he said, his voice flat and commanding. Richard reached over and picked up the envelope. His hands, rough from years of hard work, slowly pulled back the metal clasp. He slid the contents onto the white tablecloth. My heart plummeted. They were not plane tickets. They were not photos of a future grandchild. The first thing that slid out was a stack of glossy, brightly colored brochures. I picked one up with trembling fingers. It was for a state-funded assisted living facility called Sunset Meadows. The pictures showed grim hospital-like rooms and elderly people sitting in wheelchairs staring at televisions. It was the cheapest, lowest-tier nursing home in the entire county, a place known for neglecting its residents. Right behind the brochures was a thick stack of legal documents. The bold black letters at the top of the first page read, "Durable power of attorney and transfer of assets." I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at Richard and I could see the color draining from his face. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of confusion and rising anger. Julian did not even blink. He looked at us with a chilling, calculated stare. "It means exactly what it looks like, Dad. You are both getting too fragile and forgetful to manage the estate. The pharmacy business is a multi-million-dollar asset, and you two are dragging it down. You are old. You are making mistakes." I felt like I'd been slapped across the face. "Mistakes," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "Julian, your father and I run those pharmacies perfectly. We just had our most profitable quarter in 5 years." "What are you talking about?" Chloe chimed in, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. "Oh, please, Caroline, let us not pretend everything is fine. You left the stove burner on last week when we came over. You are a danger to yourself." That was a complete lie. I had never left the stove on. Chloe had turned it on to make tea and left it running herself. She was twisting reality to fit her narrative. And look at Richard. Chloe continued gesturing toward my husband with a manicured finger. His limp is getting worse every month. He can barely walk through the store aisles without leaning on the counters. You are both a massive liability to the business and to yourselves. It is embarrassing for Julian to explain your condition to our friends. I stood up from the table, my hands shaking so violently that I knocked over my water glass. The water spilled across the fine tablecloth, but I did not care. "You come into my home," I said, my voice rising, "on the night of my 45th wedding anniversary, and you hand me a brochure for a rundown nursing home. You want us to sign away everything we built with our own blood and sweat." Julian stood up to match my height, his face hardening into a mask of pure greed. "I am not asking, Mom. I am telling you. Sign these papers tonight. Give me full legal control over the estate, the bank accounts, and the business. If you sign them now, we can make this easy. We will put you in Sunset Meadows, and you can live out your remaining years quietly without ruining my legacy." "Your legacy," Richard shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. The plates rattled. "I built that legacy, Julian. I stood behind that counter for 40 years. You have never worked a single day in the pharmacy. You chose to go to Wall Street. You have nothing to do with our business." Julian leaned across the table, getting right in his father's face. "It is going to be mine eventually anyway. I am just accelerating the timeline. You two are incompetent. If you do not sign these documents right now, I have already spoken to a lawyer. I will take you to court. I will have a judge mandate a conservatorship. I will stand up in front of the whole town and declare you both mentally unfit to care for yourselves. Do you really want to drag your precious Christian reputation through the mud in a public courtroom?" The sheer malice in his voice was terrifying. This was not a misguided attempt at caring for aging parents. This was a hostile takeover. My own son was threatening to humiliate us, to strip us of our human rights, to lock us away in a miserable facility just so he could get his hands on our money right now. Chloe picked up her expensive purse and slung it over her shoulder. "We are doing you a favor, Caroline. You should be thanking us for taking this burden off your shoulders. We will give you until Friday to review the documents and sign them. If you do not drop them off at our house by Friday night, Julian files the petition on Monday morning. Do not make this harder than it has to be." Julian buttoned his suit jacket, looking at the spilled water on the table with absolute disdain. "See, you cannot even pour a glass of water without making a mess. You need help, Mom. Friday, do not forget." They turned around and walked out the front door, leaving it wide open behind them. The cold October wind blew into the dining room, flickering the candlelight until the flames completely died out. I collapsed back into my chair, burying my face in my hands. The beautiful roast dinner I had spent all afternoon cooking sat on the table completely cold and untouched. The silence in the house was heavy and suffocating. I looked at Richard. The man who had protected me and loved me for 45 years looked broken. He stared at the legal documents on the table as if they were a venomous snake. For a long time, neither of us said a single word. The illusion of our perfect family had shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces upon our dining room floor. Our son did not see us as his parents anymore. We were nothing more than a bank account he was ready to rob, and he was perfectly willing to destroy our lives to get the vault open. But as I sat there wiping the tears from my cheeks, a different emotion began to rise in my chest. It started as a small spark and quickly grew into a roaring fire. Julian thought we were just fragile, weak old people who would bow our heads and surrender out of fear. He thought we would simply sign away our lives because he threatened us with a courtroom. But Julian had forgotten one very important thing. He had forgotten who raised him. He had forgotten the grit and the iron will it took to build an empire from a leaky corner store. We were not going to go to a nursing home, and we were certainly not going to hand him our $4.8 million estate without a fight. The morning after our ruined anniversary dinner was the quietest I had ever experienced in our home. The sun came up just like any other day, pouring golden light across the hardwood floors Richard and I had installed ourselves 30 years ago. I stood at the kitchen sink washing the good china we barely got to use, scrubbing away the remnants of the pot roast that had gone cold and untouched. Richard sat at the kitchen table with his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He was staring at the glossy brochures for Sunset Meadows. We had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cold, calculated look on Julian's face, but in the clear light of day, the denial that only a parent can understand began to set in. Richard took off his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. He looked at me with a soft, pleading expression. "Caroline," he said gently, "Julian is just stressed. The financial consulting firm he works for has been laying people off left and right. He is under a lot of pressure. He probably thinks he is doing the right thing for us. He is just misguided. He is our son. He would never intentionally hurt us." I wanted to believe him. Lord knows I wanted to believe that the boy I carried for 9 months had simply lost his way. So we made a silent pact that morning. We decided we would not erupt in anger. We would not retaliate or argue. We would simply maintain the peace, show him grace, and prove to him through our daily actions that we were still perfectly capable of running our lives and our pharmacy. We thought love and patience would cure whatever madness had taken hold of our son. We could not have been more wrong. Our silence was not seen as grace. It was seen as weakness, and it gave Julian and Chloe the green light to tear down our boundaries completely. It started subtly just 3 days later. Richard had gone to the pharmacy to open up for the morning shift. I was sitting in the living room paying the utility bills when the front door swung wide open. There was no knock. Julian and Chloe walked right in, using the spare emergency key I had given them years ago. Chloe marched into my living room carrying a large cardboard box and a roll of heavy-duty garbage bags. She did not even say good morning. She walked straight over to the beautiful floral curtains I had sewn by hand and wrinkled her nose in absolute disgust. "This house is so dark and suffocating," Chloe said, talking to Julian as if I were completely invisible. "We need to tear down these heavy drapes and paint everything white. The current decor is aggressively outdated. It smells like a thrift store in here." I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Chloe, what are you doing with those garbage bags?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and polite. She finally looked at me, offering a smile that was entirely void of warmth. "We are decluttering, Caroline. Julian and I agreed that a cluttered environment is bad for your cognitive decline. People your age get confused when there is too much junk around. It is a safety hazard." Before I could protest, she started grabbing the frame photographs off the mantel. Pictures of Richard and me at the Grand Canyon, photos of our church picnics, the small ceramic figurines my mother had left me. She tossed them carelessly into the cardboard box. I stepped forward and grabbed her wrist begging her to stop. "Those are my memories," I said, my voice shaking. "You have no right to touch them." Julian stepped between us, towering over me. He gently but firmly pried my fingers off his wife's wrist. "Mom, stop being hysterical," he said in a tone you would use to scold a misbehaving toddler. "Chloe is trying to help you. You have too much junk in here. You are hoarding. It is embarrassing. Just sit down and let us handle this." I was forced to sit in my own armchair, completely paralyzed, while my daughter-in-law packed away the physical proof of my life. They were treating us like burdens in our own home, slowly erasing our presence room by room. But the emotional abuse did not stop with my living room. They quickly turned their sights on Richard, specifically targeting his physical pride. Richard had developed a slight limp in his right leg over the past year. It was nothing serious, just arthritis from standing behind the pharmacy counter for 40 years. He managed it well and never complained, but Julian and Chloe decided to weaponize his age against him in the most cruel way possible. Later that week, Richard came home from a long shift at the pharmacy. He walked through the front door, leaning slightly on his right leg, as he always did after a 10-hour workday. Julian and Chloe were sitting on our sofa, having let themselves in again. Chloe looked at Richard and let out a loud theatrical sigh. "It is painful to watch you walk, Richard," Chloe said, shaking her head. "You look like you're going to break a hip at any second. Why do you insist on pretending you are still capable?" Richard straightened his posture, his face flushing red with embarrassment. "I am perfectly fine, Chloe. I just put in a full day at the store. The inventory is perfectly balanced, and our customer satisfaction is at an all-time high." Julian stood up and walked over to his father, crossing his arms. "That is exactly the problem, Dad. You are standing behind the counter of a health business, looking like a fragile, crippled old man. It is bad for the brand. Customers do not want to buy their medication from someone who looks like he belongs in a hospital bed. You are driving away our younger demographic. You are hurting the profit margins because you are too stubborn to admit you belong in a nursing home." I watched my husband, a proud, hardworking Christian man, shrink before my very eyes. His own son was stripping away his dignity piece by piece, using his lifelong dedication to the business as a weapon against him. Julian and Chloe were completely relentless. They knew exactly where to strike to make us feel useless. And then came the gaslighting. They did not just attack our physical capability. They went after our minds. I have always been sharp with numbers. I managed the payroll, the vendor invoices, and the tax preparations for our business since day one. I prided myself on my organized ledgers. One afternoon, Julian barged into my home office. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the monthly wholesale orders. Julian snatched the ledger right out of my hands. He flipped through the pages, shaking his head with a mock expression of deep concern. "Mom, what is this mess?" Julian asked, pointing to a perfectly balanced column of numbers. "You are completely messing up the accounts. You paid the supply vendor twice this month." I frowned and stood up to look at the page. "That is not true, Julian. I paid the current invoice and the advance for next month's seasonal stock. It is clearly marked right there in the margin." Julian slammed the book shut. "Stop making excuses, Mom. You are confused. You cannot even add basic figures anymore. Yesterday, I checked the bank statements and you forgot to pay the electricity bill for the store. Do you want us to lose our power? Do you want to ruin the business?" I knew for a fact I had paid the bill. I had the confirmation receipt in my filing cabinet. But Julian spoke with such aggressive certainty that for a brief, terrifying second, I actually doubted my own mind. He was trying to rewrite my reality. He wanted me to feel incompetent. He wanted me to believe that my mind was failing, so I would willingly hand over the control he so desperately craved. The true depth of their cruelty became apparent when they started isolating us from our community. For over 30 years, Richard and I had been active members of the First Baptist Church downtown. Our congregation was our extended family. We sang in the choir, organized the Sunday school bake sales, and hosted Bible study in our living room every Wednesday night. Our friends at the church were our lifeline. Julian and Chloe knew this, and they knew that if we spoke to our friends, someone might realize what was truly happening to us. So they systematically cut us off. It happened on a bright Sunday morning. Richard and I were dressed in our Sunday best, ready to drive to the 9 o'clock service. We were just putting on our coats when Julian's car pulled into our driveway. He unlocked our front door and stepped inside, blocking the exit. Where do you think you are going? Julian demanded, putting his hands on his hips. We are going to church, Julian, just like we do every single Sunday. Richard replied, reaching for the door handle. Julian stepped firmly in front of the door, his chest puffed out. No, you are not. You are both way too fragile to be out in public today. There is a flu bug going around the congregation, and with your weakened immune systems, it is a death sentence. Plus, Mom, you look completely exhausted. You are staying home where it is safe. I am not exhausted, I argued, feeling the frustration bubbling in my throat. Please move out of the way, Julian. We are going to be late for Pastor Thomas's sermon. Julian's face grew dark. He pulled the spare keys to our car out of his pocket and dangled them in front of us. I moved your car to the back of the driveway and blocked it in with my SUV. You are not going anywhere. I am making the executive decisions for your health now. You will thank me later. We were literally held hostage in our own foyer. Richard put a gentle hand on my arm and guided me back to the living room. He did not want to cause a physical altercation with our son. We sat on the sofa in our Sunday clothes, listening to the clock tick, feeling completely powerless. But the absolute worst part came later that afternoon. Our good friend from church, a lovely woman named Martha, who always sat in the pew next to us, called the house landline to check on us. She knew we never missed a Sunday service. I was in the kitchen pouring a glass of water when the phone rang. Julian, who had stayed at our house specifically to monitor us, answered the phone in the living room before I could reach it. I stopped in the hallway and listened. Oh, hi, Martha, Julian, said his voice dripping with fake syrupy sadness. Thank you so much for calling. Yes, I am afraid Mom and Dad could not make it today. There was a pause as Martha spoke on the other end. Then Julian continued, lowering his voice into a dramatic, sorrowful whisper that made my blood run absolutely cold. Honestly, Martha, things are getting very bad. Mom's mind is going fast. The doctor says it is early stage dementia. She gets incredibly confused and agitated in large crowds, and Dad is just too frail to handle her on his own. We are keeping her home for her own safety. It breaks my heart, but we have to face reality. Please pray for her. Yes, I will pass along your love. But it is probably best if you do not call or visit for a while. Seeing people from her past triggers her episodes. Thank you for understanding. He hung up the phone. I stood frozen in the hallway, the glass of water trembling in my hand. He was not just keeping us trapped inside the house. He was actively destroying our reputation. He was spreading a vicious lie to the people who cared about us, planting the narrative that I was losing my mind. He was building a wall around us, cutting off our access to anyone who could help. They wanted everyone to believe the tragic story of the dutiful son taking over for his mentally declining parents. That way, when he finally dragged us into a courtroom to take our estate, the entire town would nod in sympathy and agree that Julian was doing the right thing. I walked quietly back into the kitchen, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The denial was completely gone. This was not stress. This was not a son who was just misguided or overwhelmed by his job. This was a calculated, predatory takeover of our lives. Julian and Chloe were stripping away our independence, our dignity, and our community layer by agonizing layer. They wanted us to feel old, broken, and completely alone. They wanted us to give up. But as I set my water glass down on the granite countertop, I looked at my reflection in the kitchen window. I saw the lines on my face earned by decades of hard work. I saw the gray in my hair, but I did not see a broken woman. I saw a survivor. Julian thought he was dealing with a frail old lady who would quietly surrender to a nursing home. He had no idea what was actually waiting for him. The emotional cruelty Julian and Chloe inflicted on us was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated smokescreen. While they were busy telling our church friends and our neighbors that my mind was failing, they were working furiously behind the scenes to steal the actual foundation of our lives. The realization did not hit me all at once. It started with something as simple and routine as the afternoon mail. For 40 years, I had been the one to walk down to the mailbox at the end of our driveway. I knew our billing cycles by heart. I knew exactly when the vendor invoices arrived, when the utility bills were due, and most importantly, when our bank statements were delivered. The financial statements for our personal joint accounts and the main operating accounts for our pharmacies always arrived by the 5th day of the month. I had balanced those ledgers at my kitchen table since we opened our very first store. November 5th came and went. Then the 6th. By the 8th day of the month, I knew something was terribly wrong. I sat at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on, sorting through a pile of junk mail and grocery store coupons, feeling a cold knot of dread forming deep in my stomach. I picked up the landline and called our local bank branch asking to speak to a manager I had known for over a decade. I asked him why our statements had not arrived in the mail. His response made the blood freeze in my veins. He told me the mailing address for all our primary accounts had been changed through the online banking portal just 2 weeks prior. All of our financial documents were now being routed to a private post office box in the city, a post office box registered to Julian. I hung up the phone and stared blankly at the kitchen wall. Julian had stolen our mail. He was actively rerouting our entire financial history to keep Richard and me completely in the dark. He was relying on the malicious lie that I was too confused and senile to notice missing paperwork. He thought I was just a tired old woman who would forget what day the bank statements were due. But he had fundamentally underestimated me. I had managed the cash flow for a multi-million-dollar retail business while raising him from a baby. My mind was as sharp as a tack, and the fog of maternal denial was rapidly burning away. The missing bank statements were only the beginning of the nightmare. 2 days later, a substitute mail carrier accidentally slipped a letter addressed to Julian into our home mailbox. The envelope was from the county tax assessor. Ordinarily, I would have just set it aside on the counter for him to pick up later, but my maternal trust was completely dead. I took a butter knife from the drawer, carefully slit the top of the envelope open, and pulled out the heavy legal paperwork. It was a property transfer notice. A few years ago, Richard and I had purchased a small, vacant commercial lot directly behind our second pharmacy location. We bought it for a very reasonable price, hoping to eventually pave it and expand the store's parking lot for our customers. It was a modest piece of real estate worth maybe $75,000, but it belonged to us. The official county document in my hands indicated that the deed to that exact lot had been legally transferred into a newly formed limited liability company. It was a company name I had never heard of in my entire life. Icy. I flipped to the bottom of the second page. There, sitting directly above the dotted signature line, was my husband's name. I know Richard's handwriting like I know the lines on my own face. I have watched him sign countless prescriptions, birthday cards, and bank checks. His signature has a distinct sharp loop on the capital letter R, and he always presses firmly on the paper. The signature on this county document was entirely wrong. The ink pressure was light and shaky. The loops were overly exaggerated. It was a forgery. A blatant, sloppy, desperate forgery. My own son had forged his father's signature to steal a piece of commercial real estate right out from under us, transferring it to a shell company he controlled. I walked straight into the living room where Richard was sitting in his favorite armchair reading his Bible. I did not say a single word. I simply placed the forged county document right over the pages of his open book. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in confusion, and then he looked down at the paper. I stood there and watched his eyes scan the legal jargon. I watched his gaze stop at the forged signature at the bottom of the page. I watched the exact moment the man I loved realized his only son was an active criminal. Richard did not yell. He did not throw anything. A terrifying, heavy silence fell over him. For a man of such deep, quiet patience, that absolute silence was more frightening than any angry scream. He slowly folded the paper, slid it into his shirt pocket, and stood up from his armchair. He walked straight down the hallway and went into his home office, the room where he kept 40 years of our business ledgers, tax returns, and property deeds. I heard the heavy wooden door shut firmly behind him. An hour later, a commercial locksmith pulled into our driveway. Richard had called him to completely change the locks on the office door and to install a heavy-duty industrial deadbolt. From that day forward, my husband treated his home office like a secure fortress. He spent hours locked inside, meticulously auditing every single physical document, every bank transfer receipt, and every tax record from the past 5 years. He was hunting for any other discrepancies. Whenever he needed to step out to get a cup of coffee or use the restroom, he would pull the door shut and lock the deadbolt behind him. He was shutting Julian out completely. The implicit, unspoken trust that makes a family function was gone. We were living in a war zone under our own roof, and we were quietly fortifying our defenses. Julian, however, possessed a predator's instinct. He immediately sensed the shift in our behavior. He realized we were no longer acting like the docile, easily confused victims he desperately needed us to be. His subtle manipulations began to crack, and his panic began to show. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Julian came over unannounced. He marched through the front door carrying a clipboard, trying to wear a mask of absolute authority and efficiency. He walked straight into the kitchen where Richard and I were drinking tea. Mom. Dad, we need to have a serious talk about consolidating your physical assets, Julian said, pacing back and forth across the kitchen tiles like a caged animal. I have been looking over the estate planning process with my lawyers. You both have way too many loose ends tying up capital. I need to take a full inventory of what is sitting in your safety deposit boxes at the downtown bank. I need the physical keys and the access pin codes today so I can catalog the contents and start moving things into the primary trust account. Richard slowly placed his teacup down on its saucer. He looked up at Julian with a gaze as hard and unyielding as steel. That will not be necessary, Julian, Richard said, his voice completely level and calm. Your mother and I know exactly what is in those safety deposit boxes. We have our financial affairs perfectly organized. We do not need your help with the bank. The mask finally slipped. Julian stopped pacing. His face turned a deep, blotchy shade of red. The charming, concerned son completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered man. What do you mean you do not need my help? Julian shouted, slamming his hand down on the kitchen counter so hard the sugar bowl rattled. You are hoarding valuable assets you cannot even manage properly. I am your son. I am trying to save this family from financial ruin. I have a legal right to know what is in those boxes to protect my future. You need to give me those keys right now. You have no legal right to anything we own, Richard replied, his voice dropping dangerously low. And you will not be getting those keys. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Julian absolutely lost his mind. He grabbed a ceramic fruit bowl from the center island and hurled it directly into the stainless steel sink, shattering it into dozens of sharp pieces. He screamed that we were ruining his life, that we were paranoid old fools, that we were going to lose the entire pharmacy business because we were too stubborn and stupid to let him take total control. He kicked a wooden kitchen chair out of his way, sending it crashing to the floor, and stormed out of the house. He slammed the front door so violently that the glass panes rattled in their wooden frames. I stood in the center of the kitchen, picking up a broom to sweep the broken pieces of ceramic from the floor. My hands were perfectly steady. The heavy, blinding fog of emotional abuse had completely lifted, leaving behind a sharp, terrifying clarity. This was no longer just a story about a greedy son wanting his parents out of the way so he could inherit the family business a few years early. This was a desperate, active crime. Julian needed access to our safety deposit boxes and our liquid cash immediately. His violent, unhinged reaction to being told no proved it beyond any shadow of a doubt. He was not patiently waiting for us to pass away in a nursing home. He was actively robbing us right now, and he was absolutely terrified because he realized we were finally putting heavy locks on the vault doors. I swept the broken pottery into the dustpan, looking at my husband. Richard met my eyes and gave a slow, grim nod. We knew our son was stealing from us. We knew he was trying to dismantle our lives. We just needed to find out why he was so incredibly desperate for millions of dollars right this very second and what he was willing to do to get it. It was well past midnight, but my eyes remained wide open in the dark bedroom. Richard was breathing softly beside me, finally finding a few hours of peace after the relentless stress of the past few weeks. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the heavy weight of our grim reality pressing down on my chest. My mind kept replaying the image of the shattered ceramic fruit bowl on the kitchen floor and the forged signature on the county property document. The son I had nurtured, protected, and loved with all my heart was actively trying to destroy us. The emotional emotional pain was a real physical ache, a sharp knot in my stomach that simply refused to loosen. I tried to pray in the silence of the room, asking for guidance, asking for some logical explanation as to why our own flesh and blood would turn against us so viciously. I tossed and turned, tangling the soft bed sheets until I finally realized that sleep was simply not going to come to me tonight. My throat was incredibly dry, parched from the anxiety that had become my constant unwelcome companion. I carefully slipped out from under the heavy quilts, making absolutely sure not to wake Richard. He needed all the rest and strength he could possibly get for the battles that surely lay ahead of us. I put on my thick cotton robe and walked out of the bedroom, stepping quietly onto the hardwood floor of the hallway. The house was completely silent, wrapped in the heavy, isolating stillness of the middle of the night. This house used to be my ultimate sanctuary. Every single room held a cherished memory of a birthday party, a festive holiday morning, or a quiet Sunday afternoon spent as a family. Now it felt like a cold fortress under siege. I walked down the wooden stairs, gripping the banister tightly, my bare feet making no sound at all. I was just heading to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of cold water, hoping it would soothe the dry ache in my throat and calm my racing thoughts. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something incredibly strange. A faint, flickering light was spilling across the living room floor, coming directly from the backyard patio. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart gave a sudden hard thump against my ribs. I knew for a fact that I had locked all the doors and turned off all the exterior lights before coming up to bed hours ago. I crept closer to the living room, keeping my body pressed flat against the hallway wall so I would stay completely hidden in the dark shadows. Through the large glass sliding doors, I saw the silhouettes of two people standing on the outdoor stone patio. The main patio light was off, but the amber glow of a nearby street lamp illuminated their figures perfectly. It was Julian and Chloe. They must have parked their car down the street and let themselves in through the side garden gate. My very first instinct was to march over Flip on the bright living room lights and demand to know what they were doing, lurking around my property in the middle of the night. But the intense survival instinct that had been growing inside me over the last few weeks told me to stay perfectly still and observe. The sliding glass door was cracked open just a few inches, likely because Julian had stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. He had picked up that awful habit again recently, something he only ever did when he was under extreme, unmanageable stress. I held my breath and moved an inch closer to the small opening in the glass. The chilly autumn air seeped through the crack, carrying their voices directly into the quiet living room. They were not speaking in their usual arrogant, condescending tones. They were arguing in harsh, frantic whispers. It was the exact kind of whisper people use when they are absolutely terrified that someone might hear them. I pressed my ear toward the narrow gap, closing my eyes to focus entirely on their specific words. What I heard in the next few minutes would completely erase the last lingering drops of maternal denial I held in my fragile heart. I heard Julian pacing back and forth across the stone patio. His footsteps were heavy and incredibly erratic. He sounded exactly like a man who was drowning and gasping for his final breath. "You do not understand what is happening," Chloe, Julian hissed, his voice cracking with a level of panic I had never heard from him before. "The margin calls are coming in tomorrow morning. I am completely out of time. I do not have the liquidity to cover them. They are going to freeze every single account we have." Chloe responded with a sharp, venomous hiss. "What do you mean you do not have the liquidity? You told me the day trading accounts were up 30% this quarter. You told me we were fully covered for the new house renovations, the country club membership fees, and the imported cars." "That was a lie," Julian groaned, letting out a sound of pure, pathetic desperation. "It was all a massive lie, Chloe. The day trading accounts were completely wiped out 6 months ago. The market took a massive downward turn, and I tried to to double down to make the money back. I leveraged our own house. I took out second and third mortgages, using fraudulent appraisals just to keep up appearances for your friends. The luxury cars, your designer clothes, the extravagant vacations to Europe, it is all built on massive, suffocating debt. We do not own anything. I stood frozen in the dark living room, my hand clamped tightly over my mouth to stop myself from gasping out loud. My son, the arrogant financial consultant who loved to flaunt his wealth and mock our modest lifestyle, was completely broke. He was a massive fraud living a total lie. But it gets much worse, Julian continued, his voice dropping into a terrified, shaky whimper. When the traditional banks stopped lending money to me, I panicked. I took out massive offshore loans to cover the domestic debts. I borrowed money from people you do not ever want to owe money to. I thought I could trade my way out of the financial hole, but I lost that money too. The offshore lenders are not like regular banks, Chloe. They do not just send polite collection letters in the mail. They are calling in their markers by the end of the month. If I do not wire them $2.5 million in 3 weeks, they are going to come after us. They are going to take everything, and then the federal regulators are going to see the forged loan documents I used for our house. We are going to lose everything we have ever known, Chloe. Everything. There was a long, horrifying silence on the patio. I could only hear the sound of the cold wind rustling through the large oak trees in the backyard. I waited for Chloe to react fully, expecting her to cry or comfort her husband in his absolute darkest moment. But Chloe did not cry. Chloe did not offer him a shoulder to lean on or a word of support. Instead, she unleashed a cold, calculating fury that chilled me to the very marrow of my bones. "You are an absolute idiot, Julian," she spat out, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated disgust. "I knew you were hiding some financial losses, but I had no idea you were stupid enough to forge federal loan documents and get involved with offshore loan sharks. You have put my entire life in jeopardy. My reputation, my social standing, everything I have built is tied to your pathetic, childish lies." "I know it is my fault, and I'm so sorry," Julian pleaded, sounding like a frightened little boy begging for mercy. "But we have a way out. We just need the pharmacy estate. Mom and Dad have $4.8 million in liquid assets and property value. If we can just get them to sign the power of attorney documents, I can liquidate the primary business accounts and pay off the offshore lenders before the end of the month." "Then why are we wasting time trying to convince them they have dementia?" Chloe snapped viciously. "You have been playing this slow, stupid game for weeks, stealing their mail, hiding their bank statements, trying to make them look crazy in front of their church friends. It is taking way too long. Your father changed the locks on his office. They are on to you, Julian. They are not going to just hand over the keys to the kingdom because you handed them a cheap nursing home brochure." "I know that now," Julian said frantically. "But if we push too hard, they will go to the local police. They will expose the forged property deed I filed." Chloe let out a dark, ruthless laugh. "Then we do not give them the chance to go to the police. Listen to me very carefully, Julian. If the old fools do not sign over the $4.8 million estate by the end of the month, we are going to prison for fraud. We need to speed up the timeline. We cannot wait for a judge to grant a conservatorship. We cannot wait for them to slowly lose their minds. We need that money right now. We have to force their hands, or we have to find a permanent way to remove them from the equation completely. We will take them on that weekend trip to the mountains," Chloe continued, her tone dropping into a terrifyingly casual register. "You know the spot I am talking about. The old overlooked trail. It is incredibly isolated. It is dangerous for elderly people to walk there. We get them out there away from their security cameras and their locked offices. We demand the master passcodes to their offshore trust accounts. And if they refuse to give us the access we need to save ourselves, then they have a tragic, fatal accident on the hiking trail. We inherit everything as your legal right. The offshore debt gets paid, and our massive problem is solved." I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. It was never about our health. It was never about us being a burden in our old age. It was a desperate, bloody race against a prison sentence. My son and his wife were not just thieves was trying to take an early inheritance. They were actively plotting to murder Richard and me to cover up their own massive financial crimes. I did not stay to hear Julian's response. I did not need to hear it. The heavy, contemplative silence that followed Chloe's deadly proposal was all the confirmation I required. I slowly backed away from the sliding glass door, placing each foot carefully on the hardwood floor to ensure I did not make a single sound. I moved like a ghost through my own living room, my hands shaking so violently I had to press them flat against my sides just to keep them steady. I crept back up the stairs, my heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm in my ears. I reached our bedroom and gently closed the door behind me. I walked over to the bed and looked down at Richard, who was still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that our only child was standing in our backyard, planning our brutal murders. The profound, crushing sorrow of a mother losing her beloved son vanished completely in that very moment. It evaporated into the cold night air, leaving behind something much stronger and much more dangerous. A fierce maternal survival instinct took root deep in my soul. I was no longer a grieving mother trying to understand her child. I was a protector preparing to defend the man I loved and the legacy we had built together. I climbed back into bed, staring into the darkness with absolute terrifying clarity. Julian and Chloe thought we were just two frail, oblivious old fools waiting to be slaughtered for our life savings. They thought they held all the cards, but they did not know I had heard every single word of their bloody confession. The time for tears and denial was officially over. The time for war had just begun. The very next morning, I woke up long before the sun even had a chance to peek through our heavy bedroom curtains. I lay there in the quiet, absolute darkness of our room, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of Richard breathing beside me. Just 24 hours ago, my heart had been breaking into a million jagged pieces over the loss of my son. I had been drowning in a suffocating sea of sorrow, desperately wondering where I went wrong as a mother and how my own child could treat us with such bitter contempt. But after creeping downstairs in the middle of the night, after hearing Julian and Chloe whispering on the patio, after hearing them coldly calculate the exact timeline of our murders, every single drop of that sorrow simply evaporated. It was gone, completely wiped away by a harsh and unforgiving reality. In its place was a chilling, absolute survival instinct. I felt a coldness spread through my veins that I had never experienced in my entire 68 years of life. I was no longer a weeping mother mourning the sweet boy she had raised. I was a protector, and I was going to do whatever it took to keep my husband and myself alive. When Richard finally opened his eyes and sat up in bed, I was already dressed and sitting in the armchair by the window. I did not cry. I did not shake. I looked my husband directly in the eyes, and I told him every single word I had overheard on the patio. I told him about Julian leveraging his own house to the point of ruin, the disastrous offshore loans he had taken out in a panic, the forged documents he used to cover his tracks, and the desperate, bloody deadline he had with violent loan sharks. And then I told him the most horrifying part of all. I told him about Chloe suggesting the isolated mountain trail, their plan to demand the master passcodes to our accounts at the edge of a cliff, and their ultimate strategy to push us into the rocky ravine if we refused to cooperate. I watched the color completely drain from my beloved husband's face. I saw the sheer terror, the profound heartbreak, and the sickening disbelief wash over him in heavy waves. For a long, agonizing time, Richard just stared at the bedroom wall, processing the unimaginable reality that his only child wanted him dead. But Richard is a remarkably strong man. He took a deep breath, reached out and held my hands firmly in his own. We did not shed a single tear that morning. We made a silent, sacred vow to each other right there in our bedroom. We were going to survive this nightmare, and we were going to make them pay for every ounce of their wicked, murderous betrayal. We knew that if we confronted them immediately, they would deny everything. They might even panic and attack us right then and there in our own home, knowing their timeline was running out. We needed undeniable proof. We needed a bulletproof strategy that would protect us and expose them to the authorities. So we decided to give them exactly what they wanted. We were going to pretend to be the weak, docile, declining old fools they believed us to be. We were going to feed their arrogant egos until they were so blindly confident that they would never see our trap closing around them. Later that afternoon, Julian and Chloe came over under the guise of checking on our health. It was physically sickening to watch them walk through our front door knowing they were actively plotting our deaths. But Richard and I played our parts perfectly. When I poured tea for them in the kitchen, I intentionally let my hand shake, spilling hot water onto the counter and dropping a ceramic mug on the floor. I apologized profusely, acting completely confused and terribly embarrassed by my own clumsiness. I saw Chloe shoot a triumphant, knowing look at Julian across the kitchen island. They absolutely ate it up. They truly thought my mind and my body were finally giving out. Richard played his part brilliantly too. He asked Julian the same simple question 3 times in a row, pretending he had completely forgotten the answer each time. Julian sighed dramatically and rolled his eyes, clearly irritated, but secretly thrilled that his father was supposedly losing his cognitive abilities. It was during this very visit that Julian planted the seed for their deadly plan. He leaned forward over his teacup, wearing his mask of fake concern, and suggested that we all needed a relaxing family getaway to clear our heads and bond. He mentioned a beautiful, secluded cabin near a highly elevated, rugged portion of the Appalachian Trail. He said the fresh mountain air would be wonderful for our stress and anxiety. He promised it would be an easy, flat walk, completely safe for our fragile condition. Looking into the eyes of the boy I had given birth to, knowing he was actively luring us to our execution, took every single ounce of strength I possessed in my soul. But Richard smiled a warm, grandfatherly smile and agreed immediately. He told Julian it sounded like a wonderful idea to reconnect as a family. The trap was set, but Julian had no idea he was the one walking right into it. The very next morning, we put the second phase of our survival plan into motion. We told Julian we were going to the pharmacy to handle some routine paperwork and would be busy all day. Instead, we drove 2 towns over to a nondescript office building to meet with a man named Mr. Bradley. Mr. Bradley was a private investigator, a former federal agent with a fierce reputation for being absolutely ruthless and incredibly thorough. He was not a man who dealt in emotions or family drama. He dealt in hard, undeniable facts and legal evidence. We sat in his sparse, poorly lit office and told him everything. We told him about the missing bank statements, the forged property deed we found in the mail, the massive debts Julian had mentioned on the patio, and the overheard murder plot. Mr. Bradley did not blink or show any shock. He simply pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad and started writing. He promised us he would untangle every single thread of Julian's financial web, and he did exactly that with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours, Mr. Bradley had cracked Julian's entire life wide open. The reality was actually much worse than we had ever imagined. Julian had not just made a few bad trades on the stock market. He had systematically defrauded several high net worth clients at his financial consulting firm. He had funneled millions of dollars into illegal offshore accounts, trying to cover his initial losses, digging a hole so deep he could never possibly climb out. The people he owed money to were not standard bankers or debt collectors. They were dangerous, violent individuals who operated completely outside the law and did not forgive unpaid debts. Julian was facing federal prison time for wire fraud and severe physical harm from his illegal creditors if he did not produce $2.5 million in cash by the end of the month. He was a desperate, cornered animal, and our estate was his only ticket to survival. But Mr. Bradley did more than just investigate the financial crimes. He provided us with the tools we needed to document the ongoing abuse in our own home. While Julian and Chloe were occupied at their own house on the other side of town, Mr. Bradley's security team came to our property. They worked quickly and silently, installing state-of-the-art, microscopic hidden cameras in our living room, our kitchen, and our home office. The lenses were practically invisible, hidden inside smoke detectors, behind picture frames, and tucked inside the decorative molding of the ceiling. Every single conversation, every unauthorized entry, every threatening gesture Julian and Chloe made inside our walls would now be captured in high-definition audio and video. The footage was automatically uploaded to a secure cloud-based server that only Mr. Bradley and our legal team could access. We were turning our home into a digital fortress, and our abusers had no idea they were starring in their own documentary. With the surveillance in place and the truth about Julian's massive debts confirmed, Richard and I took the final, most crucial step of our secret defense. We drove into the city to the most prestigious estate law firm in the state, meeting with a senior partner who specialized in aggressive asset protection. We sat in his mahogany-paneled conference room and executed a massive, irreversible financial maneuver. We took the entirety of our $4.8 million estate, every single penny from our business operating accounts, our personal savings, our retirement funds, and the equity in our commercial properties, and we moved it all into an ironclad, untouchable blind trust. We structured the trust with absolute, unforgiving precision. Julian was completely removed as a beneficiary. He was formally stripped of all medical and financial power of attorney. If Richard and I were to suddenly pass away, whether by natural causes or a tragic accident on a mountain trail, the trust dictated that the entire $4.8 million would be immediately liquidated. The funds would be distributed directly to a dozen different charities dedicated to protecting vulnerable senior citizens from financial abuse. Julian would not receive a single dime. Furthermore, the lawyer drafted a specific binding clause stating that any previous wills, testaments, or power of attorney documents held by our son were entirely null and void. The paperwork was signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed securely away in the firm's vaults. Walking out of that law firm and stepping into the afternoon sunlight, I felt an overwhelming sense of power and profound relief. Julian and Chloe thought they were fighting for a golden ticket, but the vault was already completely empty, and the locks had been permanently changed. They were plotting a brutal murder for an inheritance that no longer existed. Our money was safe. Our life's work and legacy were protected from their greedy hands, but our physical lives were still very much in imminent danger. The weekend trip to the Appalachian Trail was fast approaching. Mr. Bradley had strongly advised us against going. He told us it was far too dangerous to put ourselves in a physically isolated location with two desperate criminals who had nothing left to lose. He wanted to take the financial evidence to the police immediately, but Richard and I knew that if we backed out now, if we tipped our hand too early, Julian would simply deny the murder plot claim. The financial issues were a misunderstanding, and find another way, another time, and another place to strike us down when we were not prepared. We needed to end this nightmare permanently. We needed to catch him in the very act of betrayal, to gather the absolute, undeniable physical proof required to put him behind bars for the rest of his natural life. We were going to walk up that mountain. We were going to look the devil right in the eyes, and we were going to let him dig his own grave. The weekend passed with an agonizing slowness. Every minute felt like an hour. Every hour felt like a lifetime. Richard and I moved through our home like silent ghosts waiting for the inevitable explosion. We knew Julian was going to discover the financial barricade we had built. It was only a matter of time before he tried to access the funds he so desperately needed for his offshore creditors. We did not have to wait long. Monday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky, matching the suffocating dread that hung in the air of our living room. I was sitting on the sofa pretending to read a magazine, but my eyes were fixed on the small tablet hidden under a throw pillow. The tablet was connected to the hidden cameras Mr. Bradley had installed. Through the screen, I was watching the live feed of our driveway. At exactly 10 in the morning, Julian's luxury sport utility vehicle came screeching into the driveway. He did not park carefully. He left the car at a sharp angle, the tires digging deeply into the pristine lawn I had maintained for decades. The car door flew open and Julian stormed out. His face was a twisted mask of absolute rage and blind panic. He looked completely unhinged. His tie was loosened, his hair was messy, and he was clutching his mobile phone so tightly, I thought the glass screen would shatter in his bare hands. He stomped up the front steps, but instead of using his key to come through the front door, he veered off toward the side of the house. He was heading straight for the detached garage. Richard was in the garage. My husband had gone out there an hour earlier to organize some old pharmacy display fixtures, a mundane task designed to make him look perfectly normal and unsuspecting. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew Richard was prepared for a confrontation, but seeing the pure, unadulterated violence radiating from our son's posture terrified me to my core. I quickly switched the camera feed on the tablet to the wide-angle lens positioned in the rafters of the garage. The image flickered onto the screen just as Julian violently kicked the side door open. The heavy wooden door slammed against the interior wall with a deafening crack. Richard, who had his back turned to the door, jumped and dropped a box of plastic signs. He turned around, playing the role of the startled, confused elderly father to absolute perfection. His hands shook slightly and his eyes grew wide with manufactured fear. Julian did not even pause to apologize for breaking the door hinge. He marched right up to his father, invading his personal space, invading the safety of the man who had taught him how to ride a bicycle and tie his shoes. Julian shoved his mobile phone directly into Richard's face. "What did you do?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, hysterical edge. "What did you do to the accounts I just tried to log into the pharmacy operating portal to review the quarterly tax distributions? My password is blocked. My access is completely denied. I called the bank manager and he told me I am no longer an authorized signer on any of the primary estate accounts. He told me the accounts do not even exist in the same structure anymore." Richard took a slow, deliberate step backward, leaning against a heavy wooden workbench. He let his shoulders slump forward, instantly appearing 10 years older and incredibly frail. He looked at Julian with wide, blank eyes. "What are you talking about, Julian?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with a perfect imitation of elderly confusion. "I do not know anything about the passwords. You know I am terrible with the computer. I have not touched the banking portal in weeks. I just pay the bills with the paper checks." "Do not play dumb with me," Julian roared, grabbing a metal wrench off the workbench and slamming it down hard against the wood. The loud metallic bang echoed through the garage and made me flinch inside the living room. Julian leaned closer, his face inches from his father. The bank manager said the assets were moved. He said a blind trust was established on Friday afternoon. You went to the lawyers without telling me. You locked me out. Why won't Mr. Sterling return my phone calls I have? Left him 6 voicemails this morning. He is our estate lawyer. He works for our family. Why is he freezing me out? Richard lifted a shaking hand and rubbed his forehead, squinting his eyes as if he were trying very hard to understand a complicated math problem. "Mr. Sterling," Richard mumbled, looking around the garage as if the answer might be written on the wall. "I did not call Mr. Sterling. I think maybe the bank made a mistake. You know how those big banks are, Julian. They update their computer systems and everything gets scrambled. I got a letter last week about a security update. Maybe that is why your password does not work. I can call them tomorrow and ask them to fix it." Julian stared at his father. For a fleeting, agonizing second, I saw a flicker of doubt cross my son's angry face. Richard was giving an Academy Award-winning performance. He looked so small, so deeply confused, so genuinely lost. But Julian was desperate, and desperate men are not easily fooled. Julian's eyes narrowed into dark, suspicious slits. He dropped the metal wrench and grabbed Richard by the shoulders of his flannel shirt. He did not hit him, but the physical intimidation was undeniable. He gripped the fabric tightly, shaking his father slightly. "Listen to me very carefully, Dad." Julian hissed, his breath visibly pluming in the cold garage air. I need access to that capital today. Do you understand me? I have critical investments that require immediate liquidity. If you lock that money away in some kind of trust because your mind is slipping and you got paranoid, you need to undo it right now. You need to call the bank and authorize my signature again. Richard gently pushed Julian's hands away. He straightened his back just a fraction of an inch, enough to reclaim a tiny piece of his dignity, but kept his voice soft and bewildered. Julian, you're scaring me. I do not understand why you are yelling about liquidity. We have plenty of money to pay for the groceries and the electricity. The pharmacy is doing fine. Why do you need our savings right now? We are going to leave it all to you when we pass away. You just have to be patient. Patient Julian laughed a harsh, jagged sound that contained zero amusement. I do not have time to be patient. You are ruining everything. You are ruining my life with your stubborn, senile games. Julian turned around and paced the length of the garage, running his hands aggressively through his hair. He looked like a trapped rat looking for an escape route. He muttered curses under his breath, kicking at a pile of sawdust on the concrete floor. He realized he was hitting a brick wall. He could not bully the passwords out of a man who was convincingly pretending to have no idea what those passwords even were. And he could not physically torture the bank manager into reversing a legally binding blind trust. Julian was completely out of legal and manipulative options. Fine, Julian finally said, his voice dropping into a chilling deadpan register. If you want to play the confused old man, we will play it your way, but you are going to fix this, Dad. One way or another, you and Mom are going to give me what I need. Julian stormed out of the garage, leaving the broken door swinging on its hinges. I watched on the tablet screen as he marched back to his luxury vehicle, slammed himself into the driver's seat, and sped out of our driveway in reverse, nearly hitting our mailbox. I set the tablet down on the coffee table and took a deep, shuddering breath. My entire body was trembling, buzzing with the adrenaline of the close call. I walked quickly to the back door and stepped out into the yard, rushing toward the garage to check on my husband. Richard was standing exactly where Julian had left him. He was leaning heavily against the workbench, his head bowed, his hands gripping the wooden edge so tightly his knuckles were stark white. I wrapped my arms around him from behind, pressing my face against his back. We stood there in the cold, smelling the sawdust and the motor oil, silently mourning the absolute death of our son's humanity. He did not care about our health. He did not care about our confusion. He only cared about the vault, and he was furious that we had swallowed the key. Later that evening, the heavy atmosphere in the house shifted from tense anticipation to a dark, ominous dread. Mr. Bradley called us on a secure, encrypted mobile phone he had provided. He had tapped into the surveillance feeds we installed in our own home, but he also had his investigators tracking Julian and Chloe's movements. Mr. Bradley informed us that Julian had spent the entire afternoon frantically calling his offshore contacts, begging for an extension on his massive debts. The extension was violently denied. Julian was given a strict, unyielding deadline. He had exactly 10 days to produce $2.5 million, or his creditors were going to seize his assets and take drastic physical measures against him and his wife. That night, Julian and Chloe returned to our house. They thought Richard and I were fast asleep in our upstairs bedroom. We were actually sitting in the dark, staring at the glowing screen of the surveillance tablet. The hidden camera tucked inside the living room smoke detector gave us a perfect bird's eye view of the two of them, standing by the fireplace. They were not yelling. The blind panic from the morning had evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and deeply sinister calm. Julian was pouring himself a massive glass of our expensive bourbon. His hands were no longer shaking. Chloe was pacing the length of the oriental rug, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "The legal route is completely dead," Julian said, taking a long drink from his glass. "The old man transferred everything into a blind trust on Friday. Mr. Sterling executed the documents and locked them down. I cannot touch the pharmacy accounts. I cannot touch the properties. I cannot even access their basic checking accounts. They played us Chloe. They are not as senile as we thought. They knew I was making moves, and they built a financial fortress right in front of my face." Chloe stopped pacing. She looked at her husband with a gaze so devoid of empathy it made my stomach physically turn. I told you this was going to happen, Julian. I told you we were wasting time playing the concerned children. Your parents are stubborn, controlling boomers who will never willingly hand over a single dime of their precious money until they are dead. Well, they are not dead, Julian snapped back bitterly. And I have 10 days before the loan sharks rip my life apart and send the fraud evidence to the feds. I am completely out of options. We have lost. Chloe took a slow step toward him. She reached out and took the bourbon glass from his hand, setting it down on the mantelpiece. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and terrifyingly clear. We have not lost, Julian. We are just changing the strategy. What strategy? Julian asked, his voice filled with exhausted defeat. There is no strategy left. I cannot force a judge to undo a blind trust in 10 days. Chloe smiled. It was the same chilling, perfectly rehearsed smile she used when she greeted the pastor at our church. We do not need a judge, Julian. We just need to accelerate the natural order of things. If your parents pass away, the trust will have to be executed according to its bylaws. As your parents' only surviving heir, the estate defaults to you. But we cannot wait for a natural death. We need an accident, a tragic, unavoidable accident. I watched my son on the glowing screen. I waited for him to push her away. I waited for him to express shock, horror, or simple human decency at the suggestion of murdering his own mother and father. But Julian just stared at his wife. The exhaustion in his posture slowly vanished, replaced by a dark, terrifying realization that she was offering him the only viable exit strategy. No. An accident, Julian repeated, testing the word on his tongue as if he were tasting it. They barely leave the house, Chloe. How are we supposed to stage an accident here without making it look like a home invasion? We do not do it here, Chloe replied smoothly, her voice completely steady and confident. We need to get them out of this house. We need to get them away from their neighbors and away from whatever security they might have set up. We take them on that hiking trip. We tell them we want to apologize for the stress of the past few weeks. We play the loving, repentant children. We drive them up to the Appalachian Trail. We take them to that scenic overlook, the one with the steep drop-off and the loose rocks. Julian nodded slowly, his eyes wide and fixed on his wife. The hiking trail. It is incredibly steep. It is completely isolated on a weekday morning. Exactly, Chloe whispered, stepping closer and resting her hands on his chest. It is so easy for an elderly person with a bad limp and a confused mind to lose their footing. One small slip. One tragic tumble down the ravine. We will be the devastated, heartbroken children who tried to save them but failed. The police will take one look at their medical records, see our claims about their declining health and poor mobility, and rule it a tragic accident. We will inherit the estate, pay off the debts, and be completely free. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The tension reached an absolute boiling point. Julian and Chloe had officially crossed the line from financial abusers to premeditated murderers. They were no longer trying to trick us out of our money. They were actively setting the stage for a violent physical confrontation, and they had absolutely no idea that their prey was watching their every single move, silently preparing to destroy them. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the final phase of their sinister plan was set into motion. Richard and I were sitting in the living room drinking coffee in complete silence when the front doorbell rang. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Julian and Chloe. They were standing on the porch holding a large woven basket filled with gourmet cheeses, crackers, and expensive wine. Julian had his head bowed, looking the very picture of a repentant, remorseful son. I took a deep breath, plastered a completely fake smile across my face, and opened the door. Julian immediately stepped forward and threw his arms around me. He hugged me so tightly it took my breath away. It was a terrifying sensation, feeling the physical warmth of the boy I had given birth to, knowing with absolute certainty that his mind was calculating exactly how to end my life. Mom, I am so incredibly sorry, Julian said, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. I have been under so much pressure at work, and I took it all out on you and Dad. I was completely out of line. Please say you can forgive me. Chloe stepped into the foyer right behind him, offering her own sickeningly sweet smile. We have both felt just awful about how tense things have been, she added, setting the gift basket on the entryway table. Family is the most important thing in the world. We hate fighting with you. We really want to make things right and start fresh. Richard walked into the hallway, his face unreadable. He looked at Julian and then at the basket. What exactly is this about, Julian? Richard asked, his voice calm and steady. Julian pulled back from our embrace and wiped a completely fake tear from the corner of his eye. Dad, I was wrong, he said, his voice dripping with false humility. You and Mom are perfectly capable. I was just projecting my own stress onto you. Chloe and I want to apologize properly. We want to take you both on a special reconciliation weekend trip. I rented a beautiful, secluded cabin near the Appalachian Trail. Just the four of us. We can breathe the fresh mountain air, cook dinners together, and reconnect as a family. It will be so relaxing for you and Mom. Please say you will come with us this Friday. I looked at Richard, and in that split second, a silent current of sheer terror passed between us. We knew exactly what this trip was. It was not a reconciliation. It was an execution. Julian had set the stage for the tragic, unavoidable accident Chloe had proposed on our patio. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I forced my facial muscles to relax into a soft, grateful expression. That sounds lovely, Julian, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We would love to go to the mountains with you. The moment they left our house, Richard locked the deadbolt and immediately called Mr. Bradley on the secure phone. We drove straight to his office and told him about the cabin and the mountain trail. I was trembling so badly I could barely hold my cup of water. I begged Mr. Bradley to take what we already had to the police. I told him we could not possibly go into the isolated wilderness with two people who wanted to kill us. But Mr. Bradley looked at us with a cold, hard dose of reality. Caroline, he said softly but firmly, if you back out now, Julian will know you are onto him. He will panic. He might hire someone to break into your house. He might tamper with your car. Right now, he thinks he is completely in control of the narrative. We need to let him play his hand, but we are going to rig the deck. He wants to force a confession out of you about the trust accounts before he pushes you. We need that audio on a police record. We need him to vocalize his intent and his physical threat. Mr. Bradley reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, heavy black box. He opened it to reveal a tiny state-of-the-art audio recording device. It was no larger than a coat button. He explained that he was going to sew this device directly into the thick collar of Richard's winter hiking jacket. The microphone was incredibly sensitive, capable of picking up a whisper from 20 feet away in heavy wind. It was completely waterproof and indestructible. It had a battery life of 72 hours and transmitted a continuous encrypted signal directly to a secure server. More importantly, it had an emergency GPS locator. Mr. Bradley promised us that he and two armed former federal agents would be tracking us the entire time. They would be parked at the base of the trail ready to intervene the second Julian made a physical move. Friday morning arrived with a heavy, thick layer of gray clouds covering the sky. Julian and Chloe picked us up in their luxury vehicle. The 2-hour drive up into the Appalachian Mountains was an agonizing exercise in psychological torture. Chloe played soft classical music on the radio and chatted endlessly about how beautiful the autumn leaves were going to look. Julian bought us hot coffees and joked about old family memories. They were playing the role of the loving children so flawlessly that it made my blood run absolutely cold. They were laughing and smiling with us, knowing full well they intended to leave our broken bodies at the bottom of a ravine. The cabin was located at the very end of a long, winding dirt road. It was stunning, built of heavy cedar logs with massive glass windows, but it was terrifyingly isolated. There were no other houses for miles. The cell phone service dropped completely dead the moment we turned off the main highway. The silence of the deep woods was oppressive heavy and completely isolating. I realized how easy it would be for someone to disappear out here and never be found. That night, Chloe cooked a lavish dinner. She poured us expensive wine and served thick cuts of steak. She laughed and toasted to our family reconciliation. I forced myself to chew the food, though it tasted like ash in my mouth. Richard sat beside me, wearing his thick winter jacket even inside the cabin, claiming he felt a bit of a chill. I knew the wire was securely tucked inside his collar, silently recording every fake laugh and every poisonous lie our daughter-in-law spoke. When we finally retreated to our bedroom for the night, I locked the heavy wooden door and pushed a sturdy wooden chair beneath the handle. Richard and I lay awake in the dark, holding hands. The wind howled outside the cabin windows, rattling the glass. We did not sleep a single minute. We just lay there silently praying for the strength to survive the morning. Saturday morning broke with a biting, bitter cold. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Julian knocked loudly on our bedroom door at 7 o'clock sharp. "Rise and shine," he called out, his voice entirely too cheerful. "We need to hit the trail early before the fog rolls in. I have the perfect route planned for us." I dressed in layers, putting on my heavy wool sweater and my thickest hiking boots. Richard put on his rigged jacket, patting the collar once to ensure the device was active. We walked out into the living room where Julian and Chloe were already waiting. They were dressed in high-end technical hiking gear. Julian was carrying a large, heavy backpack. I knew exactly what was inside it: ropes, emergency flares, and an extensive first aid kit. Props he would use later to show the authorities how desperately he had tried to save us after we supposedly slipped. We drove a few miles down a bumpy logging road to reach the trailhead. The area was completely deserted. There was not a single other car in the dirt parking lot. The wooden sign at the entrance marked the path as an advanced, unmaintained route. I looked at Julian and forced a nervous smile. "Julian, this sign says the trail is advanced. Are you sure this is a good idea for your father and me?" Julian patted my shoulder reassuringly. "Do not worry, Mom. The sign is just to keep the tourists away. The path is actually very flat and well worn. It leads to the most spectacular overlook in the entire state. I promise I will not let anything happen to you. We will take it slow." We began the ascent. Chloe walked in the front, setting a brisk, demanding pace. I walked behind her, followed by Richard, with Julian bringing up the rear. He was positioning himself perfectly to ensure neither of us could turn back or stumble without him catching us. The path was not flat. It was incredibly steep, covered in slick, damp leaves and jagged, loose rocks. The incline was brutal on our older joints. Within 30 minutes, my lungs were burning and my legs felt like lead. Richard's slight limp became much more pronounced as we navigated the treacherous, uneven terrain. He leaned heavily on a wooden walking stick he had found near the parking lot. Every time Richard slowed down to catch his breath, Julian would step up right behind him, crowding his personal space. "Keep moving, Dad." Julian would say, his voice losing some of its fake warmth. "The overlook is just a little further. We do not want to miss the morning light." The psychological toll of that climb was 1,000,000 times worse than the physical pain. Every time my foot slipped on a wet rock, my heart stopped wondering if this was the moment Julian would reach out and shove me. I listened to the crunch of his expensive hiking boots right behind my husband, knowing he was just waiting for the terrain to become deadly enough to execute his plan. The isolation was absolute. The trees grew thicker and taller, blocking out the gray sky until we were walking in a perpetual twilight. The only sounds were our heavy breathing and the wind rushing through the bare branches. After nearly an hour of grueling climbing, the thick forest suddenly began to clear. The path narrowed dramatically, forcing us to walk in a single file line. To our left was a solid, sheer wall of gray stone. To our right, the ground completely fell away into nothingness. We were walking along the ridge of a massive, plunging ravine. The drop was terrifying. It was at least 60 feet down to a jagged bed of sharp limestone boulders and rushing white water. The edge of the trail was crumbling and unstable, covered in wet, slippery moss. Chloe stopped walking. She stood at the very edge of the precipice, looking out over the vast gray valley below. She turned around to face us, and the fake sweet smile she had been wearing all morning was completely gone. Her eyes were empty cold and entirely devoid of human empathy. "We are here," Chloe announced, her voice echoing off the stone wall. "The scenic overlook." Julian stepped up right behind Richard and me, effectively trapping us between his wife and the steep drop-off. He took off his heavy backpack and dropped it onto the dirt path. The cheerful, dutiful son vanished into the cold mountain air. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at us with a dark, desperate, and deeply violent glare. The charade was officially over. We were standing exactly where they wanted us, isolated on the edge of the world, staring directly into the abyss. The very next morning, I woke up long before the sun even had a chance to peek through our heavy bedroom curtains. I lay there in the quiet, absolute darkness of our room, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of Richard breathing beside me. Just 24 hours ago, my heart had been breaking into a million jagged pieces over the loss of my son. I had been drowning in a suffocating sea of sorrow, desperately wondering where I went wrong as a mother and how my own child could treat us with such bitter contempt. But after creeping downstairs in the middle of the night, after hearing Julian and Chloe whispering on the patio, after hearing them coldly calculate the exact timeline of our murders, every single drop of that sorrow simply evaporated. It was gone, completely wiped away by a harsh and unforgiving reality. In its place was a chilling, absolute survival instinct. I felt a coldness spread through my veins that I had never experienced in my entire 68 years of life. I was no longer a weeping mother mourning the sweet boy she had raised. I was a protector, and I was going to do whatever it took to keep my husband and myself alive. When Richard finally opened his eyes and sat up in bed, I was already dressed and sitting in the armchair by the window. I did not cry. I did not shake. I looked my husband directly in the eyes, and I told him every single word I had overheard on the patio. I told him about Julian leveraging his own house to the point of ruin, the disastrous offshore loans he had taken out in a panic, the forged documents he used to cover his tracks, and the desperate, bloody deadline he had with violent loan sharks. And then I told him the most horrifying part of all. I told him about Chloe suggesting the isolated mountain trail, their plan to demand the master passcodes to our accounts at the edge of a cliff, and their ultimate strategy to push us into the rocky ravine if we refused to cooperate. I watched the color completely drained from my beloved husband's face. I saw the sheer terror, the profound heartbreak, and the sickening disbelief wash over him in heavy waves. For a long, agonizing time, Richard just stared at the bedroom wall, processing the unimaginable reality that his only child wanted him dead. But Richard is a remarkably strong man. He took a deep breath, reached out, and held my hands firmly in his own. We did not shed a single tear that morning. We made a silent, sacred vow to each other right there in our bedroom. We were going to survive this nightmare, and we were going to make them pay for every ounce of their wicked, murderous betrayal. We knew that if we confronted them immediately, they would deny everything. They might even panic and attack us right then and there in our own home, knowing their timeline was running out. We needed undeniable proof. We needed a bulletproof strategy that would protect us and expose them to the authorities. So we decided to give them exactly what they wanted. We were going to pretend to be the weak, docile, declining old fools they believed us to be. We were going to feed their arrogant egos until they were so blindly confident that they would never see our trap closing around them. Later that afternoon, Julian and Chloe came over under the guise of checking on our health. It was physically sickening to watch them walk through our front door, knowing they were actively plotting our deaths. But Richard and I played our parts perfectly. When I poured tea for them in the kitchen, I intentionally let my hands shake, spilling hot water onto the counter and dropping a ceramic mug on the floor. I apologized profusely, acting completely confused and terribly embarrassed by my own clumsiness. I saw Chloe shoot a triumphant, knowing look at Julian across the kitchen island. They absolutely ate it up. They truly thought my mind and my body were finally giving out. Richard played his part brilliantly too. He asked Julian the same simple question 3 times in a row, pretending he had completely forgotten the answer each time. Julian sighed dramatically and rolled his eyes, clearly irritated, but secretly thrilled that his father was supposedly losing his cognitive abilities. It was during this very visit that Julian planted the seed for their deadly plan. He leaned forward over his teacup wearing his mask of fake concern and suggested that we all needed a relaxing family getaway to clear our heads and bond. He mentioned a beautiful secluded cabin near a highly elevated, rugged portion of the Appalachian Trail. He said the fresh mountain air would be wonderful for our stress and anxiety. He promised it would be an easy, flat walk, completely safe for our fragile condition. Looking into the eyes of the boy I had given birth to, knowing he was actively luring us to our execution, took every single ounce of strength I possessed in my soul. But Richard smiled a warm, grandfatherly smile and agreed immediately. He told Julian it sounded like a wonderful idea to reconnect as a family. The trap was set, but Julian had no idea he was the one walking right into it. The very next morning, we put the second phase of our survival plan into motion. We told Julian we were going to the pharmacy to handle some routine paperwork and would be busy all day. Instead, we drove 2 towns over to a nondescript office building to meet with a man named Mr. Bradley. Mr. Bradley was a private investigator, a former federal agent with a fierce reputation for being absolutely ruthless and incredibly thorough. He was not a man who dealt in emotions or family drama. He dealt in hard, undeniable facts and legal evidence. We sat in his sparse, poorly lit office and told him everything. We told him about the missing bank statements, the forged property deed we found in the mail, the massive debts Julian had mentioned on the patio, and the overheard murder plot. Mr. Bradley did not blink or show any shock. He simply pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad and started writing. He promised us he would untangle every single thread of Julian's financial web, and he did exactly that with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours, Mr. Bradley had cracked Julian's entire life wide open. The reality was actually much worse than we had ever imagined. Julian had not just made a few bad trades on the stock market. He had systematically defrauded several high net worth clients at his financial consulting firm. He had funneled millions of dollars into illegal offshore accounts, trying to cover his initial losses, digging a hole so deep he could never possibly climb out. The people he owed money to were not standard bankers or debt collectors. They were dangerous, violent individuals who operated completely outside the law and did not forgive unpaid debts. Julian was facing federal prison time for wire fraud and severe physical harm from his illegal creditors if he did not produce $2.5 million in cash by the end of the month. He was a desperate, cornered animal, and our estate was his only ticket to survival. But Mr. Bradley did more than just investigate the financial crimes. He provided us with the tools we needed to document the ongoing abuse in our own home. While Julian and Chloe were occupied at their own house on the other side of town, Mr. Bradley's security team came to our property. They worked quickly and silently, installing state-of-the-art microscopic hidden cameras in our living room, our kitchen, and our home office. The lenses were practically invisible, hidden inside smoke detectors behind picture frames and tucked inside the decorative molding of the ceiling. Every single conversation, every unauthorized entry, every threatening gesture Julian and Chloe made inside our walls would now be captured in high-definition audio and video. The footage was automatically uploaded to a secure cloud-based server that only Mr. Bradley and our legal team could access. We were turning our home into a digital fortress, and our abusers had no idea they were starring in their own documentary. With the surveillance in place and the truth about Julian's massive debts confirmed, Richard and I took the final, most crucial step of our secret defense. We drove into the city to the most prestigious estate law firm in the state, meeting with a senior partner who specialized in aggressive asset protection. We sat in his mahogany paneled conference room and executed a massive, irreversible financial maneuver. We took the entirety of our $4.8 million estate, every single penny from our business operating accounts, our personal savings, our retirement funds, and the equity in our commercial properties, and we moved it all into an ironclad, untouchable blind trust. We structured the trust with absolute unforgiving precision. Julian was completely removed as a beneficiary. He was formally stripped of all medical and financial power of attorney. If Richard and I were to suddenly pass away, whether by natural causes or a tragic accident on a mountain trail, the trust dictated that the entire $4.8 million would be immediately liquidated. The funds would be distributed directly to a dozen different charities dedicated to protecting vulnerable senior citizens from financial abuse. Julian would not receive a single dime. Furthermore, the lawyer drafted a specific binding clause stating that any previous wills, testaments, or power of attorney documents held by our son were entirely null and void. The paperwork was signed, witness notarized, and filed securely away in the firm's vaults. Walking out of that law firm and stepping into the afternoon sunlight, I felt an overwhelming sense of power and profound relief. Julian and Chloe thought they were fighting for a golden ticket, but the vault was already completely empty, and the locks had been permanently changed. They were plotting a brutal murder for an inheritance that no longer existed. Our money was safe. Our life's work and legacy were protected from their greedy hands, but our physical lives were still very much in imminent danger. The weekend trip to the Appalachian Trail was fast approaching. Mr. Bradley had strongly advised us against going. He told us it was far too dangerous to put ourselves in a physically isolated location with two desperate criminals who had nothing left to lose. He wanted to take the financial evidence to the police immediately. But Richard and I knew that if we backed out now, if we tipped our hand too early, Julian would simply deny the murder plot, claim the financial issues were a misunderstanding, and find another way, another time, and another place to strike us down when we were not prepared. We needed to end this nightmare permanently. We needed to catch him in the very act of betrayal, to gather the absolute undeniable physical proof required to put him behind bars for the rest of his natural life. We were going to walk up that mountain. We were going to look the devil right in the eyes, and we were going to let him dig his own grave. We stood at the edge of the jagged limestone cliff, the cold autumn wind whipping around us, carrying the bitter scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. Below us, the sheer drop of 60 feet ended in a violent, churning river, bordered by massive gray boulders. I looked at the boy I had given birth to, the child I had rocked to sleep through countless fevers, the man whose future I had sacrificed my own youth to secure. The loving, attentive son from the car ride had completely vanished. In his place stood a desperate, cornered predator. Julian dropped his heavy backpack onto the dirt path with a dull thud. He crossed his arms and stared at Richard and me with a coldness that froze the blood in my veins. Chloe stood beside him, her perfectly styled hair blowing in the wind, a cruel, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She did not even try to hide her contempt anymore. The mask had completely fallen away. We were isolated miles away from civilization, and they held all the power. Or so they thought. Julian took a slow, deliberate step toward us, forcing Richard and me closer to the precarious, crumbling edge of the ravine. His eyes were dark, unblinking, and filled with a frantic rage. He did not ask how our legs were feeling or if we needed to rest. Instead, he delivered his final, deadly ultimatum. "Listen to me very carefully." Julian spat, his voice dropping into a harsh, venomous register that echoed against the stone walls of the mountain. "I know exactly what you two did. I know you moved the estate into a blind trust. I know you tried to lock me out of my own inheritance. But you are going to fix it right now. You are going to give me the master passcodes to those offshore accounts, and you are going to call your lawyer on speakerphone to authorize a complete, irrevocable transfer of $2.5 million to a routing number I provide. You will do it right this second, or you will not be walking back down this mountain." I felt my breath catch in my throat, hearing the actual words, hearing the naked physical threats spoken out loud by my own child was a physical blow. It was one thing to overhear their plot in the middle of the night, but facing the barrel of his murderous intent was unimaginably horrifying. Richard stood his ground, leaning on his wooden walking stick. He adjusted the collar of his jacket slightly, a subtle movement that I knew was to ensure the hidden microphone captured every single syllable of our son's extortion. Richard looked at Julian not with fear, but with a profound, crushing disappointment. "You are making a terrible mistake, Julian," Richard said, his voice echoing with the quiet, unyielding authority of a father who was deeply, irrevocably ashamed of his son. "The money is secured in a trust. It cannot be moved with a simple phone call, and even if it could, I would never give it to you to pay off your criminal debts. You have destroyed your own life with your lies and your greed. I will not let you destroy our legacy to save yourself from the consequences of your own actions. You need to turn yourself in, Julian. It is the only way out of this." Julian let out a guttural, furious scream that sounded more animal than human. "I am not going to prison because you are too stubborn to help your own flesh and blood." He roared, his face turning a blotchy, violent shade of red. "You owe me that money. I am your son. You are supposed to protect me." Chloe stepped forward, her eyes flashing with impatient malice. "Stop wasting time talking to them, Julian," she hissed sharply. "They are not going to cooperate. They have made their choice. They care more about their precious money than they do about your life. Finish this. Finish it right now so we can go home." The sheer brutality of her words hung in the freezing air. She was casually ordering our execution as if she were asking him to take out the garbage. Julian looked at me, and for a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of hesitation, a microscopic ghost of the boy who used to hold my hand when he was afraid of the dark. But the hesitation vanished instantly, swallowed by his overwhelming selfish terror of going to prison and losing his luxurious lifestyle. He lunged forward. It happened so fast, my mind could barely process the sequence of events. Julian did not use his hands. He lowered his shoulder and drove his body weight directly into Richard's chest with explosive, violent force. Richard stumbled backward, his hiking boots slipping on the slick, wet moss covering the edge of the limestone cliff. I screamed my husband's name and reached out to grab his jacket, desperate to pull him back from the precipice. But as my fingers closed around the thick fabric of his sleeve, Julian shoved me too. A hard, forceful push directly against my collarbone. The ground simply vanished beneath my feet. The solid earth was replaced by a terrifying, empty void. I felt the sickening plunge of gravity taking hold of my body. The gray sky spun wildly above me, replaced by the blur of jagged rocks, bare tree branches, and the rushing brown water of the river far below. I heard myself screaming a raw, primal sound of absolute terror that was quickly swallowed by the rushing wind. Richard and I were falling together, tumbling over the edge of the 60-foot ravine, cast into the abyss by the very person we had brought into this world. The fall was a chaotic, violent blur of agonizing pain and disorienting motion. We crashed against the steep, rocky incline, our bodies bouncing off hard limestone outcroppings and tearing through thick, thorny vegetation. Every impact sent a blinding shockwave of agony radiating through my bones. I felt sharp branches slicing through my clothes, tearing at my skin. I tumbled over and over, completely out of control, unable to stop the terrifying momentum of our descent. My shoulder slammed into a massive tree root, wrenching my arm backward with a sickening crack. I gasped for air, but the wind was knocked completely out of my lungs. I closed my eyes, waiting for the final fatal impact against the boulders at the bottom of the gorge. But the fatal impact never came. Miraculously, about 40 feet down the sheer drop, the terrain flattened out slightly into a narrow, hidden lower ridge. This ridge was completely covered by a dense, tangled canopy of thick mountain laurel brush and old rotting tree trunks. We crashed violently into this heavy web of vegetation. The thick woven branches acted like a brutal but effective net, catching our falling bodies and breaking our downward momentum just 20 feet above the deadly churning river. I lay there suspended in the thorny brush, gasping desperately for oxygen. My entire body felt as though it had been beaten with hammers. Searing, fiery pain radiated from my right shoulder, and my ribs throbbed with every shallow breath I took. I could taste the sharp metallic tang of blood in my mouth, and hot liquid trickled down the side of my face from a gash on my forehead. My vision was blurry, spinning with dark spots, but I forced my eyes open. I was battered, bleeding, and in excruciating agony, but I was alive. Against all odds, the mountain had spared us. A few feet away from me, tangled in a thick patch of broken branches, I saw Richard. He was lying on his side, his face covered in dirt and blood. His heavy winter jacket was torn, but the thick collar remained intact. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, he did not move. Panic seized my throat. I tried to call out his name, but my voice was nothing more than a dry, weak rasp. I dragged my battered body across the damp, rocky soil, ignoring the screaming pain in my shoulder. I reached out with a trembling hand and touched his arm. Richard gasped suddenly, his eyes flying open. He coughed, spitting out a mouthful of dirt, and looked directly at me. His face was contorted in pain, but his eyes were sharp and incredibly lucid. He reached out and grabbed my hand, squeezing my fingers with surprising strength. We were both alive. The hidden ridge had saved us from the fatal drop Julian had intended. Suddenly, the harsh sound of loose rocks tumbling down the incline above us broke the silence. Pebbles and dirt rained down on our heads, pattering against the thick brush. Someone was scrambling down the steep face of the cliff. It was Julian. He was coming down to check his work. He was coming down to make absolutely sure his parents were dead. My instinct was to scramble to my feet, to scream for help, to try and hide deeper in the brush. But Richard tightened his grip on my hand, his fingers digging into my skin with fierce urgency. He pulled himself slightly closer to me, his face inches from mine, his eyes locked onto my gaze, transmitting a silent, desperate command. "Do not move!" Richard whispered, his voice so low it barely registered over the sound of the rushing river below. "Play dead. We have to play dead. Let him bury himself. Let the wire catch every single word." I understood instantly. If Julian found us alive, he would finish the job. We were trapped on a narrow ridge with nowhere to run, and broken bodies that could not fight back. Our only chance of survival and our only chance of ensuring he went to prison for the rest of his life was to convince him that his murderous plan had succeeded perfectly. I closed my eyes, let my body go completely limp, and slowed my breathing until it was practically non-existent. I forced my muscles to relax, ignoring the searing pain in my shoulder and ribs. I lay there in the cold dirt, mimicking the stillness of a corpse. The crunching of heavy boots grew louder and closer. I could hear Julian grunting as he lowered himself onto the hidden ridge. He landed with a heavy thud just a few feet away from where Richard and I lay motionless in the tangled brush. My heart hammered in my chest so violently I was terrified he would hear it beating. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to open my eyes and fight, but I remained perfectly still, frozen in the dirt like a stone. I heard him step closer. The toe of his expensive hiking boot brushed against my leg. He stood over us, breathing heavily from the exertion of the climb. Chloe's voice drifted down from the top of the cliff, sounding impatient and completely unbothered by the fact that she had just orchestrated the murder of her in-laws. "Are they dead?" Chloe called out, her voice echoing down the ravine. "Is it done, Julian?" Julian did not answer immediately. I felt his shadow fall across my face. He crouched down beside Richard. I heard the rustle of fabric as Julian roughly patted down his father's torn jacket. He was searching for something. I heard the unmistakable sound of a leather wallet being pulled from a pocket. Julian was robbing his father's supposed corpse. He was taking the credit cards and the cash, confirming his absolute lack of humanity. "Yes," Julian finally called back up to his wife, his voice completely devoid of emotion or remorse. "They are both gone. They hit the lower ridge hard. Their necks look broken. It is over." I lay in the dirt, feeling the coldness of the earth seep into my bones, listening to my only son confirm my death with casual relief. The boy I had loved, the boy I had celebrated, the boy I had forgiven, time and time again, was standing over my battered body, stealing from his father, feeling nothing but satisfaction that we were out of his way. "Good," Chloe shouted back down, her tone brisk and businesslike. "Grab whatever you need and get back up here. We need to finalize the story. Remember exactly what we practiced. We were walking near the edge, taking pictures. Your father lost his footing on the wet moss. Your mother tried to grab his arm to save him, but his momentum pulled her over the edge with him. It happened so fast, we could not reach them in time. We are devastated. We are in shock. We call the police from the ranger station down the road. It is the perfect tragic slipping accident." Julian replied, standing up and kicking a loose stone over the edge of the ridge into the river below. The local cops will not ask twice. Old people fall on these trails every single year. Let's go. We have to make that phone call and secure the estate before the banks close on Monday. I listened to the sound of Julian scrambling back up the steep, rocky incline. The loose dirt and pebbles rained down on us once more as he climbed away, leaving his parents for dead in the cold, isolated ravine. I kept my eyes tightly shut, forcing myself to remain completely motionless until the sounds of his heavy boots faded entirely into the wind. I waited until I heard the distant, muffled sound of their luxury vehicle starting its engine and driving away down the dirt logging road. Only then, when the absolute silence of the mountains settled around us, did I finally open my eyes. I turned my head slowly, fighting through the agonizing pain in my neck, and looked at my husband. Richard was looking back at me, his face battered and bleeding, but his eyes were shining with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. We were broken, bleeding, and abandoned at the bottom of a cliff, but we were alive. And thanks to the tiny wire hidden in Richard's collar, we had captured every single word of their bloody confession. The trap had closed, and Julian had no idea he was already locked inside it. The heavy silence of the Appalachian forest wrapped around us the very second the crunch of Julian's expensive hiking boots faded into the distance. I lay there in the cold, damp dirt, staring up through the jagged canopy of broken branches that had miraculously saved our lives. Every single breath I took was a sharp, stabbing agony in my chest. My right shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening heat. I turned my head slowly, dragging my cheek against the rough soil to look at Richard. My husband was battered and bleeding from a nasty cut across his forehead, but his eyes burned with a fierce, unyielding light. The man I had loved for over 40 years looked back at me with a silent, powerful promise. We had survived. We had looked the devil in the eyes, and we were still breathing. Richard slowly moved his uninjured arm. He reached up toward the thick collar of his torn winter jacket. His fingers fumbled for a brief second, finding the small, hard lump hidden beneath the heavy fabric. It was the device Mr. Bradley had meticulously sewn into the lining before our trip. With a deliberate, forceful press, Richard activated the emergency global positioning system beacon. A tiny vibration against his collarbone confirmed the signal had been successfully transmitted. The silent alarm was now screaming out to Mr. Bradley and his team of former federal agents who were waiting exactly as planned at the base of the mountain. We did not dare to speak. We did not know if Julian might suddenly change his mind and come back down the ridge to double-check his gruesome work. So we lay there in the freezing dirt, holding hands and waiting. The physical pain was absolutely excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the profound, shattering agony in my soul. I closed my eyes and pictured the tiny, helpless baby I had brought home from the hospital 35 years ago. I remembered kissing his scraped knees when he fell off his bicycle. I remembered working late shifts to afford his college tuition. I had poured every ounce of my love, my energy, and my life into raising him, and he had just pushed me off a 60-foot cliff to steal our life savings. The sorrow that had been choking me for weeks finally burned away completely. In its place, a cold, terrifying, and absolute clarity took root. I was no longer a grieving mother. I was a survivor, and I was going to destroy the monsters who tried to end our lives. Time lost all meaning on that narrow, hidden ridge. The cold autumn wind whipped through our torn clothes, chilling us to the very bone. Just as the numbness began to creep into my fingers, I heard a sound that made my heart leap. It was not the sound of heavy hiking boots returning. It was the rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades cutting through the heavy gray sky. The sound grew louder and more intense, echoing off the steep limestone walls of the ravine. Through the thick canopy of mountain laurel brush, I saw the sleek, dark shape of a private rescue helicopter hovering directly above us. Within minutes, highly trained professionals in dark dark tactical gear were rappelling down ropes from the helicopter. They moved with absolute silent precision. There were no flashing sirens or loud megaphones. This was a covert extraction coordinated entirely by Mr. Bradley to ensure our survival remained a complete secret from the local authorities and from our murderous children. One of the men landed softly on the ridge beside us. He immediately checked our vital signs and spoke softly into a headset. "We have the targets," he whispered. "Both are alive and conscious. Prepare for immediate airlift." They carefully secured Richard and me into heavy reinforced rescue baskets. The pain of being moved was blinding, but I kept my teeth clenched shut, refusing to make a sound. We were slowly hoisted up through the air, leaving the bloody patch of dirt and broken branches behind us. As they pulled me inside the cabin of the helicopter, I saw Mr. Bradley sitting in the corner. He did not smile, but he gave me a slow, respectful nod. The door slid shut, the pilot banked hard to the right, and we flew rapidly away from the mountain. We did not go to the local county hospital. Julian and Chloe would undoubtedly be monitoring the local emergency rooms, waiting to formally identify our bodies. Instead, Mr. Bradley had arranged for us to be flown to a highly secure private medical facility 2 counties over. The helicopter landed on the roof of the hospital, where a trusted medical team was already waiting with stretchers. They rushed us through a restricted set of double doors directly into a private trauma wing that was completely sealed off from the general public. From the moment we arrived, we ceased to be Richard and Caroline. We operated under entirely new identities. The medical bracelets on our wrists displayed the fake names Mr. Bradley had legally established for us. Our presence in the hospital was a ghost story. There would be no record of our admission, no insurance claims tied to our real names, and absolutely no way for Julian to ever find out we were lying in those hospital beds. The doctors worked on us for hours. They reset my dislocated shoulder, took countless x-rays, and wrapped my fractured ribs tightly. Richard required several stitches on his forehead and casting for a broken wrist, but miraculously, we had both escaped any severe internal injuries. The thick canopy of brush on that lower ridge had truly been a cushion sent by grace itself. When the nurses finally left us alone to rest, I lay in the pristine white hospital bed, hooked up to an intravenous drip of painkillers, looking across the dim room at my husband. He was sleeping heavily, the exhaustion and trauma finally taking their toll on his body. The next morning, the door to our private room clicked open. Mr. Bradley walked in carrying his familiar yellow legal pad and a small silver laptop computer. He pulled a chair up to the space between our 2 beds and opened the laptop. His face was stoic and strictly professional, but I could see a glimmer of profound satisfaction in his eyes. "I have something you both need to hear," Mr. Bradley said softly. "Your performance on the mountain was flawless. The recording device survived the fall perfectly. It did not drop a single second of audio. We have the entire confrontation crystal clear." He pressed a button on the keyboard. Instantly, the sterile hospital room was filled with the sound of the freezing mountain wind and the crunching of boots on gravel. Then I heard Julian's voice. It sounded so aggressive, so desperate, and so incredibly evil. I heard him demand the master passcodes to our offshore accounts. I heard him threaten us. I heard Richard calmly refuse him, telling him to turn himself in. And then I heard Chloe. I heard my daughter-in-law coldly tell my son to finish the job so they could go home. I heard the sickening thud of Julian shoving my husband and my own terrified scream as we tumbled over the edge of the cliff. But the recording did not end there. Mr. Bradley had isolated the audio from when Julian climbed down the ridge to check our bodies. The sound was so incredibly crisp. I could hear Julian breathing heavily as he patted down his father's torn jacket. I heard him pull the leather wallet from Richard's pocket. I heard him yell up to Chloe, confirming that our necks looked broken and that we were completely dead. And I heard their final chilling agreement to lie to the police, to call it a tragic slipping accident, and to claim the $4.8 million estate. Mr. Bradley paused the recording and closed the laptop. "It is undeniable, premeditated attempted murder," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "It is conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and elder abuse. We have have everything we need to put them in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. The local police have already been to the trail. I intercepted the police reports this morning. Your son and daughter-in-law gave their tearful statement to the Rangers exactly as they planned. They are currently back at their house thinking they have won the lottery. I looked at Richard. He slowly reached out across the gap between our beds and took my hand. We had the ultimate weapon. We held their entire future in the palm of our hands, and they were completely oblivious. Later that evening, the hospital nurse brought us a dinner tray and turned on the small television mounted on the wall. She flipped the channel to the local evening news broadcast. I was about to ask her to turn it off so I could rest when a familiar face flashed across the screen. I gasped and squeezed Richard's hand so hard my knuckles turned white. It was Julian and Chloe. They were standing on the front porch of our home, the very home they had tried to murder us to steal. They were surrounded by local news reporters and flashing cameras. Julian was wearing a dark, somber suit. Chloe was wearing a modest black dress, holding a crumpled tissue in her hand. They were playing the role of the grieving, heartbroken family to absolute perfection. My son looked directly into the news cameras and let a single perfect tear roll down his cheek. He spoke in a shaky, trembling voice that was designed to garner sympathy from the entire city. My parents were wonderful, loving people. Julian said, his voice breaking with manufactured sorrow. They wanted to take a walk to enjoy the autumn leaves. We told them the trail was too close to the edge, but they insisted. My father lost his footing on the wet moss. My mother tried to catch his arm, and they both went over. We tried to reach them. We tried so hard, but we were too late. It is a devastating tragedy for our family. We are completely heartbroken. Chloe leaned her head against Julian's shoulder, acting like a devastated, fragile widow in mourning. They were the best in-laws anyone could ever ask for, she added, wiping her dry eyes with the tissue. We are asking for privacy during this incredibly difficult time as we make arrangements for their estate and plan a beautiful memorial service to honor their legacy. I stared at the television screen, absolutely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of their audacity. They had just pushed us off a 60-foot cliff, and now they were standing on our porch, soaking up the sympathy of the public and eagerly preparing to liquidate the $4.8 million estate they believed was now legally theirs. They thought they had committed the perfect crime. They thought the blind trust would default back to Julian as the sole surviving heir. They thought all their massive criminal debts to the offshore loan sharks were about to be paid off with our blood money. They had absolutely no idea that the blind trust was completely ironclad and stripped them of every single penny. They had absolutely no idea that their entire murderous confession was sitting on a secure federal server. And most importantly, they had absolutely no idea that Richard and I were sitting in a private hospital room 2 counties away, watching their pathetic performance on television, battered and bruised, but very much alive. I reached for the remote control and turned the television off, plunging the hospital room into a quiet, peaceful silence. The heartbreak, the confusion, and the maternal guilt were officially things of the past. I looked at my husband, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. Let them plan the funeral, I whispered to Richard. Let them call the estate lawyers. Let them think they have won everything, because when we finally walk back through that front door, the look on their faces will be the beginning of their absolute destruction. The silent gathering of evidence was complete. Now it was time to prepare for our resurrection and to deliver a brand of justice they would never, ever see coming. For 14 agonizing days, Richard and I existed as ghosts, hidden away from the world. We remained securely tucked within the sterile white walls of the private hospital facility that Mr. Bradley had arranged for us. Our physical bodies were slowly healing from the brutal impact of the fall down that rocky mountain ravine. My dislocated shoulder ached with a dull, persistent throb, and Richard still wore a thick cast on his fractured wrist. The physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, hard clarity that had completely taken over my mind. The mother who would have done absolutely anything for her son had died on that jagged cliff. The woman who survived was someone entirely different. She was a woman who understood that blood does not excuse betrayal and that unconditional love should never be a suicide pact. During those 2 weeks in hiding, we watched from the shadows as Julian and Chloe put on the performance of a lifetime. Mr. Bradley brought us daily updates, bringing thick files filled with surveillance reports and financial records. Julian was not grieving at all. He was celebrating his supposed victory. He had immediately contacted the estate lawyers, demanding expedited access to our accounts and claiming he needed the funds to settle our affairs and pay for a massive, lavish memorial service. He had absolutely no idea that the blind trust we had established was completely ironclad, and that his frantic attempts to withdraw millions of dollars were setting off massive alarm bells within the financial institution. Mr. Bradley had also brought the federal authorities into our circle. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been quietly building a massive case against Julian for wire fraud and illegal offshore banking over the past several months. When Mr. Bradley handed them the flawless, unedited audio recording of our attempted murder, the federal agents realized they finally had the ultimate leverage to take down Julian and his entire network of criminal creditors. We spent our days in that quiet hospital room, meticulously planning every single detail of our return to the land of the living. We were not just going to send the police to arrest him at his house. We wanted to expose his pure, unadulterated evil in front of the entire world. Julian had spared absolutely no expense for our supposed celebration of life. He rented out the grand ballroom at the most exclusive, expensive country club in the entire state. He invited over 100 guests, including our church congregation, our former business partners, and a flock of his own wealthy, superficial friends. It was not a memorial service designed to honor our legacy. It was a gala event designed to cement his status as the tragic, wealthy orphan who was about to inherit a massive empire. Mr. Bradley told us that Julian had even arranged for his offshore creditors to be present at the country club. They were waiting in a private dining room just down the hall from the grand ballroom, carrying leather briefcases filled with estate sale documents. Julian fully intended to sign away our life savings the very second the memorial service concluded, transferring the deed to our commercial properties and liquidating our business accounts to save his own skin. He thought he had committed the perfect crime by wrapping his financial salvation in a shroud of public grief. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of his plan fueled my determination to see justice served. The morning of the memorial service finally arrived with a crisp autumn chill in the air. I stood in front of the mirror in my hospital room and dressed in a tailored dark charcoal suit. Richard stood beside me wearing a crisp white shirt and a dark tie. We were battered, carrying deep purple bruises on our faces, and we moved with a stiff, painful slowness, but we stood incredibly tall. There was a profound, quiet dignity in our survival. We walked out of the hospital and climbed into the back of a heavily armored black sport utility vehicle. Mr. Bradley sat in the front passenger seat, constantly communicating with the local police chief and the federal agents who were already moving into position around the country club. The drive to the venue felt like a journey through another dimension entirely. The world outside the tinted windows was moving normally, completely unaware of the massive cinematic reckoning that was about to unfold. I reached out and took Richard by the hand, feeling the solid, comforting weight of his fingers wrapping around mine. We did not need to speak because we knew exactly what we had to do. When our black vehicle pulled up to the rear service entrance of the country club, my heart began to hammer a heavy, steady rhythm against my ribs. I could see dozens of luxury cars parked in the main lot, reflecting the bright morning sun. The local police chief walked over to our vehicle and opened the door. He gave us a firm, respectful nod, silently acknowledging the sheer gravity of what we were about to do. 4 federal agents dressed in dark suits with earpieces tucked discreetly into their ears stood in a tight formation around us. They had already secured the perimeter of the building, blocking all the exits and quietly isolating the private dining room where Julian and his illegal creditors were waiting. We were brought into a small, quiet hallway just behind the main stage of the grand ballroom. Through the crack in the heavy wooden double doors, I could hear the soft, mournful melody of a string quartet playing in the background. Mr. Bradley handed me a small wireless earpiece so I could hear exactly what was happening inside the room. I slipped it into my ear and closed my eyes, listening to the murmurs of the 100 guests who had gathered to mourn our tragic, untimely deaths. Then I heard the sharp, clear sound of a microphone being tapped. The room fell into a respectful silence. Julian began to speak. His voice echoed through the massive ballroom, dripping with a sickening, manufactured sorrow. He talked about how much he loved us, how we had always been his guiding light, and how our sudden tragic accident on the mountain trail had left him completely shattered. He paused at all the right moments, his voice cracking with emotion, painting himself as the devastated, dutiful son who was bravely trying to carry on our legacy. I could practically hear the guests wiping away their tears, completely captivated by his flawless performance. Chloe stepped up to the microphone next, adding her own layer of poisonous lies. She spoke about my kindness, about how I had welcomed her into the family, and about how much they were going to miss our Sunday dinners. It was a grotesque theatrical display of pure manipulation designed solely to secure a $4.8 million payday. I looked at Richard, and he looked back at me with a fierce, unwavering resolve. It was time. Mr. Bradley gave the signal to the federal agents. The local police chief placed his large hands firmly on the brass handles of the heavy wooden double doors. With a powerful, simultaneous push, the massive doors swung wide open, hitting the interior walls with a resounding, thunderous crack that instantly shattered the quiet, mournful atmosphere of the ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly, the musicians freezing with their bows suspended in midair. A sudden collective gasp rippled through the sea of 100 guests. Richard and I walked through the doorway, stepping out of the shadows and directly into the bright, warm light of the grand ballroom. We walked slowly, our battered faces and bruised bodies a stark, undeniable testament to the brutal violence we had survived. We did not look like victims at all. We walked with absolute towering authority. We were flanked on either side by Mr. Bradley, the local police chief, and the stern, unsmiling federal agents. The sheer visual impact of our entrance was like a lightning bolt striking the center of the room. The entire ballroom fell into a profound, suffocating silence. I looked straight down the center aisle, my eyes locking onto the elevated stage at the far end of the room. Julian was standing frozen at the podium. His hands were gripping the edges of the wooden stand so tightly his knuckles were completely white. The manufactured tears had instantly dried up. The color drained from his face so rapidly, he looked as though he had seen a ghost, which in his mind he absolutely had. His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by a terror so deep and absolute it radiated across the massive room. Chloe was standing right beside him, her face twisting into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She took a stumbling step backward, her expensive black designer dress suddenly looking like a prison uniform. The guests began to murmur, the sound rising like a chaotic, confused wave. People were standing up from their chairs, pointing, whispering, and covering their mouths in shock. They had absolutely no idea what was happening, but they instinctively knew they were witnessing something monumental. We continued our slow, deliberate march down the center aisle. The crowd parted for us, stepping back to give us a wide berth as we approached the stage. The federal agents moved with tactical precision, fanning out to secure the front of the room and block any potential escape routes. Julian darted his eyes frantically around the ballroom, searching for a way out, searching for his creditors, searching for any possible salvation. There was nowhere left to run. We reached the front of the stage. I did not wait for an invitation. I walked up the 3 short steps, feeling a sharp twinge of pain in my injured shoulder, but I ignored it completely. I walked right up to the podium, forcing Julian to step back away from the microphone. He looked at me, his eyes wide and trembling, his breathing shallow and erratic. He whispered my name, his voice nothing more than a pathetic, broken rasp. He said he thought we were dead and that he thought we fell. I replied smoothly into the microphone, letting my voice boom across the silent, stunned ballroom. I told him he did not think we fell because he was the one who pushed us. A collective scream of horror erupted from the guests. Julian shook his head frantically, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of denial. He stammered that it was a lie and that I was confused because the fall must have damaged my brain. Chloe chimed in, trying to salvage their rapidly crumbling facade. She told everyone I was having a mental breakdown and needed medical help right away. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice or engage in a screaming match. I simply turned to Mr. Bradley, who was standing at the base of the stage, holding a small, powerful digital audio player. He connected the device directly into the ballroom sound system. I looked out at the 100 guests, at my friends, my neighbors, and the business partners who had gathered to mourn us. I told them they did not have to take my word for it because they could listen to my son speaking his own words. Mr. Bradley pressed a button. Instantly, the crisp, clear audio of our confrontation on the mountain cliff filled the grand ballroom. Every single person in the room heard Julian using his harsh, venomous voice, demanding the master passcodes to our offshore accounts. They heard him explicitly threaten our lives if we did not transfer $2.5 million to his creditors. They heard Richard bravely refuse him. They heard Chloe coldly order Julian to finish the job so they could go home. They heard the sickening sound of the physical struggle, the violent shove, and my own terrifying scream as Richard and I tumbled over the edge of the ravine. The audio continued playing the exact moment Julian climbed down to the lower ridge. The entire ballroom listened in absolute horrified silence as my son robbed his father, taking his wallet and confirming our deaths to his wife. They heard them calmly agree to lie to the police, to call it a tragic slipping accident, and to steal our entire estate. When the audio finally stopped playing, the silence in the country club was heavier than a stone. The illusion of the loving, heartbroken family had been completely incinerated, reduced to a pile of ugly, undeniable ashes. Julian stood on the stage, his body shaking uncontrollably, his eyes darting wildly like a cornered animal. There were no more lies he could spin, no more manipulations he could employ, and no more fake tears he could shed. He was entirely exposed in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. The local police chief stepped up onto the stage, his face stern and unforgiving. He told Julian and Chloe they were both under arrest for the premeditated attempted murder of Richard and Caroline Brooks, conspiracy to commit murder, and severe elder financial abuse. At the exact same moment, the double doors at the back of the room burst open again. A team of federal agents marched in, leading 3 men in expensive suits, tightly secured in handcuffs. They were the offshore creditors, the violent men Julian had planned to pay off with our blood money. The federal agents marched them straight past the stunned guests and out to the waiting transport vehicles. The entire criminal network was collapsing all at once in a beautifully orchestrated symphony of pure justice. Federal agents swarmed the stage, pulling Julian by the arms behind his back and snapping cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. He did not fight back. He simply collapsed inward, his arrogance and pride completely shattered. Chloe began to cry hysterically as the female officers restrained her, begging for mercy, claiming it was all Julian's idea and desperately trying to throw her husband under the bus to save herself. No one was listening to her lies anymore. As the officers marched them down the stairs and up the center aisle, Julian turned his head to look at me one last time. His eyes were filled with a profound, crushing realization that he had lost everything. He had thrown away a family that loved him for a fortune that never truly belonged to him. I looked back at him standing tall beside my husband, and I felt absolutely nothing for the man in handcuffs. The boy I raised was gone, and the monster who took his place was finally facing the ultimate consequence. The public takedown was complete, and our lives were finally our own again. The federal agents moved with swift mechanical precision. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly, echoing through the silent grand ballroom. Julian, my only son, offered absolutely no resistance. His shoulders slumped forward and his head hung heavy as the weight of his own monstrous actions finally crushed him. Chloe was a completely different story. She thrashed and wailed against the grasp of the female officers. Her pristine black mourning dress became wrinkled and disheveled. She screamed that she knew nothing about the mountain, that Julian had forced her into it, and that she was a victim. But the unedited audio we had just played left absolutely no room for her desperate lies. The country club guests, the people Julian had invited to witness his grand ascension to wealth, watched in absolute horror. Wealthy investors, church members, and neighborhood friends stood paralyzed, holding their champagne glasses and whispering in shock. They watched the man they thought was a grieving orphan being led out the double doors alongside the very loan sharks he had planned to pay off with our blood money. Richard stood beside me, his posture tall and unyielding. He wrapped his good arm around my waist, drawing me close. We did not say a single word to Julian as he was marched past us. There was nothing left to say. The boy we had raised was gone. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and federal interviews. Mr. Bradley and our attorney guided us through every single step, ensuring we were completely insulated from the media circus that erupted. The local news stations that had broadcast Julian and Chloe crying on our porch just weeks prior were now running headline stories about the ultimate betrayal. The details of Julian's massive wire fraud, his illegal offshore accounts, and his staggering debts to violent criminals were laid bare for the entire world to see. The federal prosecutors did not hold back. They charged Julian and Chloe with premeditated attempted murder conspiracy to commit murder, severe elder financial abuse, and a laundry list of federal fraud charges. The loan sharks who had pressured him were also indicted, effectively dismantling a massive criminal network that had operated in the shadows for years. Knowing that Julian was sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades behind bars brought a strange, heavy kind of peace to my heart. It is a terrible, unnatural thing for a mother to find comfort in her child losing his freedom, but I had to accept the harsh, unforgiving reality. The sweet, innocent boy who used to hold my hand on the way to school had died a long time ago. In his place grew a man consumed entirely by greed, a man who viewed his own parents as nothing more than walking bank accounts waiting to be emptied. There were nights when the pain of that realization threatened to swallow me whole. I would wake up in the dark, sweating and trembling, remembering the feeling of falling backward off that limestone cliff. I would remember the terrifying, empty void beneath my feet and the cold, absolute certainty that my son wanted me to die. I cried for the family we once were. I mourned the Sunday dinners, the holiday mornings, and the quiet moments of shared laughter that were now tainted forever. But Richard was my rock. My husband holding me with his casted arm would remind me that we had survived because our love was stronger than their darkness. He told me that we could not let their evil actions define the rest of our lives. Slowly, the tears began to stop. The crushing weight on my chest began to lift. I realized that keeping my sadness was like holding on to a poison that Julian had left behind. I decided to let it go. I decided to reclaim my mind and my spirit. I was not going to be a tragic victim in my own life story. I was going to be the author of my own remaining chapters. Exactly 1 month after the dramatic arrests at the country club, Richard and I returned to the downtown law firm. We sat in the same mahogany-paneled conference room where we had first established our blind trust. The senior partner greeted us with a warm, respectful smile. He placed a thick stack of documents on the polished wooden table. It was time to make our final absolute decision regarding the $4.8 million estate. Julian and Chloe had destroyed their lives chasing that money, but they would never touch a single copper penny of it. We officially and permanently disinherited our son. We signed the legal declarations revoking any and all claims he might ever try to make against our assets. But we did not just want to hoard the money for ourselves. We had lived simply and modestly for most of our lives, and we did not need millions to be happy. We needed purpose. We directed the law firm to begin liquidating the majority of our commercial properties and business accounts. We established a permanent charitable foundation in our own names. The entire $4.8 million was carefully divided and securely invested to provide ongoing operational funding for organizations that support elderly abuse victims. We funded legal aid clinics for seniors who are being manipulated by greedy relatives. We provided resources for protective housing and medical care for vulnerable individuals who have no one else to defend them. Signing those transfer documents was the most profoundly liberating moment of my entire life. Every signature felt like breaking a heavy iron chain. We were taking the very wealth that almost caused our murders and turning it into a shield for others. I thought about all the older men and women who sit alone in their homes, terrified of the children they raise suffering in silence because they have no money and no voice. I thought about how close Richard and I came to being completely erased from the world just so a selfish young man could pay for his luxury cars and illegal gambling debts. We were going to make absolutely certain that our resources fought back against that kind of evil long after we were gone. The physical healing took time. My shoulder required months of careful physical therapy, and Richard had to wear his cast until the first snow fell. But our home, our beautiful, quiet sanctuary in the suburbs, felt entirely different now. It was no longer a place where we walked on eggshells, worrying about Julian's moods or Chloe's condescending remarks. It was a fortress of peace. We changed every lock, upgraded our security systems, and completely removed any trace of their presence from our walls. We threw away the fake smiling photographs of their wedding. We donated the gifts they had given us over the years, trying to buy our favor. We scrubbed our environment clean, leaving only the things that brought us genuine joy. We started spending more time with our neighbors, with the people from our church, and with the friends we had neglected because we were always so focused on Julian. We found out that family is not just about blood. Family is about the people who show up for you when you have nothing to offer them but your company. We built a new circle of love around us, a circle based on mutual respect and shared values. We hosted dinners and garden parties, filling the house with genuine laughter that washed away the echoes of the past. This morning, I woke up just as the sun began to rise over the horizon. I walked down the stairs, feeling the steady strength in my legs. I went into the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. The rich, warm aroma filled the house, bringing a deep sense of comfort. I poured 2 cups and walked out onto our back porch. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the fresh scent of pine trees and morning dew. Richard was already sitting there in his favorite wooden rocking chair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. He looked up at me, and his eyes crinkled at the corners with a soft, familiar smile. The cuts and bruises on his face had completely faded, leaving only the distinguished lines of a life well lived. I handed him his coffee and sat down in the chair beside him. We did not speak for a long time. We just sat there side by side, listening to the quiet singing of the morning birds. I looked out at our garden, watching the golden sunlight slowly illuminate the vibrant autumn leaves. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude wash over my entire soul. We had walked through the valley of the shadow of death. We had faced the ultimate betrayal, a betrayal so deep and personal it could have easily destroyed us. But it did not. It only made us realize how incredibly strong we truly were. We had reclaimed our lives, our dignity, and our absolute freedom. We were no longer defined by the expectations of an ungrateful child. We were defined by our own resilience and our unbreakable bond. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The nightmare was completely over. The monsters were locked away where they could never hurt anyone else ever again. And Richard and I had the rest of our beautiful, peaceful lives ahead of us. We had won. We had truly, irrevocably won. Every time I breathe in the fresh mountain air or listen to the sound of rain on our roof, I am reminded that every single day is a gift. We survive because we refuse to be victims. We survive because we chose to fight back with intelligence and undeniable proof. And we found our peace because we chose to let go of the hatred and focus our energy on doing good in the world. There are no more shadows in our home. There are no more whispered plots or fake smiles. There is only the truth and the quiet, beautiful certainty that we are exactly where we are supposed to be, safe, protected, and deeply loved by each other. We built a life that nobody can ever steal from us again. Thank you for listening. What would you have done in my place? Leave a comment below, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories.